Adjourned from the special meeting. We'll call the study session to order. And up first is a presentation from Brett Sutherland, City Engineer, regarding the Commerce City Drainage Manual.
Dylan, can you load the presentation, please?
Yep, give me just one moment, Brent.
All right, also Dylan is Dave Skudis and Andrew Earls also on the meeting.
Let me check here. It looks like they are. Would you like me to move them over now?
Yeah, they'll be helping me to present tonight, so you could give them authority.
Alrighty, I'm moving them over now, and I'm ready whenever you are, Brent.
Okay. Good evening, Honorable Mayor and member of City Council. Tonight we'll be presenting the update to the Commerce City Drainage Manual. With us tonight we have Dave Skudis and also Holly Pisa with Mile High Flood District. And we also have Andrew Earl and Jane Clary from Wright Water Engineers. And as I mentioned before, David and Andrew will be helping me to present tonight. So tonight we'll be covering the purpose and need, the technical criteria, why we need good drainage policy, retention and pump drainage, and finally our policy chapter. The presentation will be broken out into 4 sections. I'll be covering the purpose and need and the technical criteria. David will be presenting why we need good drainage policy. Andrew will be covering retention and pump drainage together. And finally, Andrew will cover the policy chapter. And then after each section, we'll take questions and discuss each topic. Next slide, please. So the purpose and need for tonight's meeting is to discuss the update to the city's drainage and criteria manual. The manual has not been updated since 1989, and most of the technical criteria is no longer used. The manual needs to be updated to match current Mile High Flood District criteria and to match our MS4, which is our water quality requirements. Next slide, please. So I wanted to mention that we're going to be recommending that the city follow the technical criteria set up by the Mile High Flood District. Communities within the metro area follow the district's criteria. The district has 3 volumes of technical criteria. Volume 1 is management, hydrology, and hydraulics. Volume 2 is structure, storage, and recreation. And Volume 3 covers stormwater quality. Tonight's presentation is not intended to get into the technical criteria, but to focus mainly on the policy issues that the city is facing. So at this point, are there any questions about this section of the presentation before I turn it over to David? All right. Hearing none, David Skudis will now be presenting the next section of the presentation.
Great, well, thanks, Brent. Is it Dylan that's controlling the slides? Is that correct?
That is correct. Just let me know whenever you want me to move on to the next one.
Well, okay. How about if I put my finger up, you move them so people don't have to hear me? Does that work for you?
Sure, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, all right, go ahead. Well, thanks for having me. Floods are the deadliest and most costly natural disasters in the world. Wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, they get a lot of publicity, but it's the flooding that hurts the most people and does the most damage, and Commerce City is no stranger to this. And here are a few photos of flooding in Commerce City. You've got roads, businesses, homes. I spoke with one of the residents in this picture, and her home was so prone to flooding that she was afraid to leave town and if rain was in the forecast. She'd lost too many cars from them getting flooded in her driveway. We built a project to help these folks. Her block is highlighted in yellow there. It's just north of 77th on Kenwood. But it was costly. Over the course of 3 decades, we've been methodically building a retrofit storm drain system. It's cost $10 to $15 million. Taxpayer dollars were spent to deal with poor land planning and substandard infrastructure. So we're here to talk about modernizing Commerce City's approach to drainage infrastructure. In Commerce City, as in most of the metro area, infrastructure is largely built by developers. Now, developers, they may pay to install public infrastructure, but the local governments, well, they inherit it. And it's the pavement, the sidewalks, water lines, sewer lines, parks, and of course, drainage. And our cities often develop in ways that are really inefficient from a long-term maintenance standpoint. So when all of that shiny new infrastructure we've inherited falls apart, there may not be enough funding to repair it. And certain approaches to land use and outdated approaches to drainage infrastructure can lead to needlessly expensive long-term costs that will be borne by the local government and by taxpayers. In a really glaring example of both a problematic land use decision and an outdated piece of infrastructure, here is Lena Gulch upstream of 6th Avenue near Colfax. Now this is in Lakewood. I use this example because I'd previously done the math on it, which took me a little time. To allow for more property to be developed, Lena Gulch was shoved into a rectangular concrete channel. Now the channel was built this way to allow for a few extra commercial buildings. Well, I looked into how much this property is worth, and with a little math, figured out how much funding the district, my organization, gets from this property. It turns out we only get about $100 a year for maintenance and around $270 a year total. I looked at what it would cost to fully replace all of this concrete someday, and at today's prices, it would take over 17,000 years for us to build up enough funding from this property to pay to replace the channel infrastructure. Now, make no mistake, the channel was configured in this way to benefit this particular property. And we've lost all ecological and recreational functions, and it will be a serious financial burden for the city of Lakewood someday when it falls apart. It's like with the I-70 project we all get the joy of driving through right now. The old viaduct, which you see on the left, lasted 50 years, and now it needs to be replaced. And now it's a brand new capital project. In this case, it's a $1 billion project. Hopefully Lena Gulch will last longer than that, I hope, but it's still going to be expensive to completely redo someday. So when we confine drainage, the water flows faster and deeper, putting more stress on the bed and banks, and that's what requires us to import all of that concrete to keep the thing glued together. So think of how the water speeds up on your garden hose when you stick your thumb over the end. The same principle applies. You shrink the area and the water moves faster. From a land use standpoint and from a design standpoint, here is our modern approach to drainage infrastructure. Now, when we give the stream plenty of room, we don't need to import all of that rock and concrete. And this is an engineered channel that used to sit under the runways of the old Stapleton Airport. It's infrastructure that looks like nature. There's the old airport there. This area withstood the 2013 flood. Here's a sunny day photo on the same creek. And then here's the same location during the 2013 flood. And then here is the same location the very next day. And then back to this photo, which was 8 months post-flood. There were no airlift rescues here, no emergency pumping. Residents near here don't worry about floods in their driveways. And there was zero maintenance post-flood. This can be maintained with a weed whacker and a trash bag because vegetation is the structure. This is a brief example of our modern approach to drainage infrastructure that your criteria updates will facilitate. With how quickly Commerce City is growing, this criteria update will protect residents from expensive taxpayer-funded retrofits in the future. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Are there any questions for the presenter regarding this? I do not see any. Please proceed.
All right, I believe, Andrew, you're next.
Thanks a lot. Let's advance the slide, please. Next one. Honorable Mayor and City Council members, thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you all this evening over Zoom. And David Skudas, thank you very much for the good lead-in. That really frames the importance of a lot of these issues that I'm going to be talking about. And what I would like to do is to kind of talk about 3 different issues tonight. And we only have 2 of them on the title slide. And what I would like to do is to give a brief presentation to frame the issues, and then pause and see if there's any discussion from council members, and then we can move on to the next issue. And the first 2 issues are shown on this slide, and those relate to retention ponds. In other words, ponds that hold stormwater and store it. And then the second issue is related to pump drainage, which is where if you can't drain things via gravity, sometimes you will use pumps. And there's some issues I want to talk and identify there and get your input on. And then the third issue is related to the policy chapter, which is related to criteria for when water quality and stormwater detention are required. And some of that information is really to bring the current manual in line with some existing criteria for detention, and also for compliance with what's called the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Permit, which is a permit from the state of Colorado that Commerce City holds that requires them to comply with a lot of different stormwater regulations. So that's a big thing about this manual, is kind of updating that so that Commerce City for now and into the future will be in compliance with those permit requirements. Next slide, please. So retention, I want to talk a little bit about what it is and what are some of the known issues. You know, we want to be very objective here, and you know, while we think that the retention policy needs to change, we want to point out some of the advantages and disadvantages, and then we'll really do the same thing for pump drainage, and then the same thing for the water quality and detention. Next slide, please. So what is retention? You know, you all driving around Commerce City have probably seen these ponds in the ground, and there's a really important distinction to be made though, because a lot of the stormwater ponds in the Denver metro area and even across the country are what we call detention ponds. And what detention means is that you have a pond, it's usually dry in most cases, and then you have rain, and the pond fills up, and then there's an outlet structure that slowly releases that volume. And there are a lot of benefits to that because it reduces the peak flow rates going out of the structure. It can save you on downstream infrastructure. But retention is different than detention. And the difference is that a retention pond does not have an outlet. It just fills up, and then the water either evaporates or infiltrates into the ground. And that can cause a number of different problems. And just to be clear on terminology, there is a practice that we use for stormwater quality that is called retention. And it's also referred to as a wet pond. So if you see ponds that have water in them, you can design some of those ponds so that when you have a rainfall event, the water level rises and then comes back out. And so as a water quality practice, that volume that you're storing, you know, it's still being drained out. Whereas with a retention pond, that volume is not drained out. And that leads to some issues. So next slide, please. So there are a number of issues with these, and you know, where retention ponds are often used, especially in Commerce City, are in areas where you either have very flat topography and you cannot get good drainage via gravity, or in areas where you don't have outfalls to a nearby receiving water. And in Commerce City, you know, a lot of the area of the city lies obviously to the east of the South Platte River, and there are highways, there are railroad tracks, there are canals in the way of being able to drain the water out there. So for a number of watersheds in Commerce City, you know, constructing outfalls to actually get the water from these tributaries out to the South Platte River is very expensive. And one reason that people have done a lot of retention in Commerce City and in some other places is so that they can still allow development to occur while they're waiting on these different outfalls to be built, which may happen at some point in the future, or it may not, just depending on funding. You know, it has a place, and it's used to kind of work around a deficiency with being able to drain water to the South Platte River. But it also comes with a lot of problems. And, you know, most of those arise out of water rights, which I think most people living in Colorado are aware that we have a water rights system where pretty much every drop of water is spoken for in Colorado. And so what retention ponds do, though, because they're storing that water, is they allow for evaporation to occur. And that water that's evaporating out of those ponds technically belongs to somebody downstream. And so really, if you have a retention pond that does not drain and it stores water for more than 72 hours, which is really what the state engineer's office rule is and what state legislation requires, you're violating Colorado water rights. And that is a big problem because the state engineer's office has really been cracking down on that lately. There's some other issues that I mean, I'm not going to read the whole slide. I assume you all have probably seen this in your information packet, and this information is there. But there's some other issues, but really, those are kind of secondary to the water rights aspect. And I would guarantee you that almost all of the retention ponds in Commerce City, very few, if any of them, have water rights, because it hasn't been common practice for people to do that. But it's now required by state law that if you have retention ponds, that you have water rights associated with those, and that if you have existing retention facilities, that they should be retrofit to drain within 72 hours, either that or you obtain water rights for them. And so just in general, in the urban drainage criteria manual that the flood district puts out, it is not good drainage policy to allow development if you don't have an outfall. And really, this issue of retention and outfalls are really inextricably linked. But you're really allowing development to occur without anywhere for the water to go, and that can lead to flooding problems. Next slide, please. This is a retention pond, and Brent could probably tell us the specific street, but this is behind a 7-Eleven store in Commerce City. And this is very typical of the types of retention ponds you see out there. And you can see this is like pea soup because it has a bunch of duckweed and algae growing in the pond. And it's just storing the water there, and it can cause odor problems and other issues in addition to the water rights issues. Next one. This is showing you a site. This is actually from Brighton. And Brighton had a big problem recently with some retention ponds that had been allowed for a development. And what you can see here is water going over a road. This is on a bright sunny day. And because of this retention pond, what happens if you don't have an outlet, the retention pond might be sized just fine for the first storm that occurs. But you might have a second storm, you might have a third storm, and if it can't drain and it's not infiltrating fast enough, that water piles up until it overflows. And up in Brighton, this has resulted in a big lawsuit. And they're going to be doing a lot of redesign at great expense to try to address this issue. And this is the kind of thing that we would like to see you all in Commerce City avoid through some updates to your criteria and better drainage policy on this issue. Next slide, please. This is another pond. This is a pretty new retention pond in Commerce City. And, this probably has some water in it from that Labor Day snowstorm that we got. But you can see this was actually a couple of weeks later, and I was out there doing a tour with a couple of Commerce City staff members, and the water's still standing there. Clearly more than 72 hours has elapsed, and that's a problem legally with the water rights situation. Next. And so this is really just kind of a quick comparison of some of the advantages and disadvantages. And, there are aesthetic advantages to having open water and wildlife advantages. And, it can be very effective as a water quality practice. But to be in compliance with state law, you need to have water rights for it, or you need to have it drain within 72 hours. And so really, as you can probably see here, some of the disadvantages, at least in our opinion, really outweigh the advantages. And one thing that some municipalities have tried to do is to say, well, the outlet for these retention areas is how they infiltrate into the ground. And in Commerce City, you all are blessed with some good soils that will infiltrate water. The problem with that over the long term, though, is the stormwater that flows into these ponds has a lot of really fine particles in it. And those plug up the bottom of the pond over time. So a newly designed facility might infiltrate within 72 hours, but after that same facility has been in service for 3 to 5 years, it's not going to do that anymore because the bottom's going to be plugged up with these fine sediments that are carried in stormwater. And then you get problems that, associated with mosquitoes and stagnation. I visited one pond very close to the Public Works office there when I was on my site visit, and I got about 6 mosquito bites while I was standing there for less than 2 minutes. So there can also be those kind of problems. Next slide, please. So these are the questions where we would like your input. And, you know, the first one really is, should retention be allowed at all in Commerce City? And if the answer to that is yes, then under what conditions should it be allowed? I mean, should people be required to demonstrate that they have adequate water rights before they build a retention pond? You know, then should retention be allowed as a water quality practice? You know, that's the same thing. Retention is probably more established and kind of less frowned upon as a water quality practice, but the water rights issues are exactly the same. So that's another question. And then, you know, one of the ideas is, well, we can build retention ponds and then some date in the future when outfalls are available, we can retrofit those. And you know, I guess my question for the group, is that really a realistic policy? You know, can you get the developers to design and pay for that up front when you might be 20 years from having an outfall for some of these ponds? And then, you know, finally, you know, what ways can Commerce City help to bring existing facilities into compliance? I mean, I think your main kind of lever there is when people have to apply for redevelopment and things like that, that you can say, we need you to comply with state law and have the adequate water rights. And then finally, you know, how should the policy for retention, whether allowed or not allowed, be integrated to a policy for outfalls? I mean, you know, one thing you could say is that we're not going to allow development without outfalls. Well, you might be waiting for 20 years to have development in some cases if that's the case. And I'm not sure that's a good decision. But so what do you do in the meantime? And that kind of relates to the next section, which is pump drainage, that we'll get into in a minute. But now that I've been kind of spewing all this out for about 10 minutes, I'd love to stop for just a minute and see if the council members or the mayor who are on this call have any questions or observations or thoughts on these ideas.
Are there any questions at this time? Councilman Hurst.
So thank you for the presentation. So far, it's been really good. One of the questions I have when we talk about retention and detention and outfalls, you know, the cost burden on creating the infrastructure in almost every situation in Commerce City today comes with public bonding through metropolitan districts, and so, or GIDs. And so one of the things I'd like to hear is just, and I know every project's different, it's really tough to give a round number, but generally, how much do you think it costs more to build the detention opposed to the retention in the outfall systems?
That's a very good question, Councilmember Hurst. And, you know, the cost of building a retention versus a detention system, it's probably not that different. I mean, you're probably going to have a little more volume if you have to build a retention pond, just because you have to oversize it to account for those back-to-back events, which would add to a little more cost on that aspect. But then, you know, if you're building a detention pond, you have the cost of developing an outlet works, or potentially in some cases a pump station. So I think those would be fairly similar. You know, there are, and I unfortunately don't need to know these off the top of my head, but there are costs and master plans that the flood district has prepared for each of these outfall systems. And you know, I've gathered that that's the way. I mean, Commerce City is not unique in that mechanism for funding a lot of these improvements. A lot of places do it. And one of the big issues, though, is that you kind of need a critical mass to get enough money. I mean, these are tens, if not, you know, probably high tens of millions of dollars for some of these outfall systems. And so no development by itself is likely to be able to pay for it. And in fact, you have a lot of developments in these watersheds that probably happened before you were doing a lot of that bonding that will benefit from this, but you don't necessarily have a way to make them pay either. And so it's a real chicken and the egg problem with funding. And, you know, what some municipalities that we've worked with have done is to, you know, do public bonding, not through the metro districts, but through the city, to pay for these, and then use the development that occurs over time to pay back those bonds. And so that could be a way, something that the council could consider. You know, that's outside of really the scope of what we're doing with the criteria manual, but it's a very pressing problem. And I think it's something to really think about. How can you pay for those outfall systems? Because a lot of the issues I'm telling you about with pump drainage and with retention will go away if you have outfalls that you can drain to. But that certainly it's a big problem, Council Member Hurst, and I know a lot of municipalities that I work with are grappling with that, and I wish there were a silver bullet for an easy solution, but there just isn't. And
Thank
so
you.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah,
So-
yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that perspective. I think my concern is you know, right now we charge on the front end with metropolitan districts, and those kind of get worked into, they do get worked into your property taxes. And what I get concerned about is just pricing the community we want to build out of this community just through these projects. Don't get me wrong, I understand their necessity and why we need to do it. And that's why I think it becomes such a tough conversation. It's just the cost of these projects, acquisition, and all the things that go into it.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's pretty easy to convince them to build the channel through their project, but trying to convince people that they should be going downstream to the South Platte River through the railroad, the canals, and the highways, that is a hard sell. And I hear what you're saying.
So,
Any other questions before we move on?
well, I was gonna say, so Councilman Hurst, I did want to clarify. So mostly the developments on Second and Third Creek have detention ponds, correct? So this retention policy that it's really affecting some parts of the core city, some parts of 96th Avenue, basically between, I would say, Highway 2 and the interstate. Those photos that Andrew was showing was basically retention ponds for what we call the Marty Farms development project. And that's basically Irondale area and just north of Irondale. There's no infrastructure for any of those particular developments. So we have detention ponds up north for the new developments. It's really the core city and, some of the Irondale areas that we're struggling with.
Thank you. Quick side note on that, Brent. We probably need to start teaching some of these metro districts how to manage those through some type of policy like this, because I know metro district ownership of those does occur in the North Range.
It does, yes.
Very good.
Councilwoman Noble.
It would seem that having a master plan for drainage so that when these projects come in, that they're all part of a system that has been figured out in advance by the city. Who is doing it well in Colorado, and how much is it costing them? I'm talking about municipalities.
Absolutely. That's a good question. And I may refer to one of our friends up from the flood district here. But the flood district for nearly 50 years has been doing drainage master plans, working in cooperation with local governments just like yours. And the existing ones that are on the books were done that way, with Commerce City working with the flood district. And I don't know exactly the latest dates of all of them, but I know some of them might be able to stand to be updated. I'll see what Dave Skoudas thinks of that. But a typical cost for a master plan, it just depends on the geographic scope. But for a watershed like Irondale or something, it's probably in the range of $250,000 to $500,000 if you didn't already have one, but you all already have them. And so you can probably do some targeted updates for a little less than that. And, people have thought through these issues. There are plans. The state law related to retention and water rights did just change a few years ago. It really got on the radar of the state engineer's office. They'd kind of been looking the other way, and, now they're not looking the other way. But I think the flood district has a real good master planning process, and they've worked with the city before. And I think that, one of the nice advantages of the manual that we've been working on is really, getting the flood district people and the Commerce City people really talking. And I mean, they do that anyway, but I think that this has really given an opportunity to really kind of reestablish that relationship. I mean, I don't know that it was ever gone, but I think to maybe strengthen it even. So I think there are real opportunities there, Councilmember Noble. And those are kind of ballpark costs. David Skoudas, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I'd say that Commerce City, pretty much the entire city, has been studied as a part of a Mile High Flood District master plan at some point in history, and we're actively doing updates to several of those right now, including Second Creek. We're getting ready to start one on Fairfax Park in that area. And so there's been lots of looks at the problem areas in Commerce City. The challenge is just how expensive and messy the projects are. The one that I highlighted in my presentation, like I said, that was one project, and it took I mean, we've been working on that project for 20, 30 years and spent 10 to $15 million because the water had nowhere to go. People got flooded, and eventually the local governments, it was mostly Adams County, but also Commerce City and the district, scrounged up enough money to systematically over time get it all the way to the South Platte River, because from where that lady's house was flooded, it might be 2 miles to where we had to take it to. And you got to build the system all the way there because you don't want to take the problem and move it to some downstream neighbors. So the challenge hasn't been so much about studying the problems. It's more about finding the money to fix them and prioritize them.
And regarding residents, are there any areas of Commerce City that are in flood insurance situations, residential areas that have to worry about flood insurance? Because if we see homes that are flooded, that would theoretically mean that they should have flood insurance or flood insurance available to them, but it wouldn't appear that they would here in Commerce City.
Yeah. I think one of the problems is with floodplain mapping, at least that FEMA recognizes and requires flood insurance on. We typically don't map floodplains until there's a watershed of a square mile or bigger. And so a lot of the problems, at least in the older parts of Commerce City, are areas that have smaller watersheds, but still plenty of rainfall lands, and the water still needs a place to go. It's just they're much smaller little areas of flow that we just don't typically map them. Fairfax Park would be a prime example where that's one of the most flood prone areas in Adams County in my experience in that area, but not in a mapped floodplain to my knowledge, just because the area that drains to it isn't quite big enough that we've ever mapped it.
Yep. No, that's
yeah.
good, David. There are a lot of local drainage issues, and one thing that Council Member Noble is, you don't have to live in a floodplain to be able to buy flood insurance. In fact, it's really cheap to buy it if you're not in a mapped floodplain. And so, for some of these local drainage issues, there might be some value in doing some public information just to let people know you can buy flood insurance if you're not in a floodplain, and it's pretty darn cheap if that's the case. And that, at least as an interim measure until you can get better drainage, would at least help to offset some of the losses that people may experience due to flooding.
One other interesting sort of contextual thing I would add is that a lot of the mapped floodplain through Commerce City is on the bigger creeks like First Creek, Second Creek, Third Creek. And the flows that produce those floodplain maps, are based on really big flood events, but there isn't a lot of history of flooding on those creeks, mostly because historically the upstream areas have been all prairie. So when it rained, it would soak into the ground. And then the creeks are all bisected, intercepted by the O'Brien Canal, Burlington Ditch, and things like that. So most of the water would never make it down here. But now all that area is developing. All the area up by the airport and all of that, and that's going to create a lot more stormwater headed towards Commerce City. So some of those areas that are in mapped floodplains, First Creek is a prime example. The flood risk is going to be felt a little more frequently, I think, than it has in the past, mostly because of all that development.
And we could be looking more at permeability, for example, in terms of policy as well, that we ask for people to do that kind of development so that we're not pooling up water. It's not just sitting there across the community on all the hardscape. There's tons of hardscape there, so that adds to the problem. What about all the ditches and gulches that run through Commerce City?
What specifically is your question about them?
Are those flood prone as well?
I don't know. Maybe Brent, you'd be able to answer that. I mean, they definitely carry water and have stormwater flow into them in sometimes uncontrolled fashion. As far as a history of them causing flooding, I guess I'm not familiar with anything specific. I don't know if you have anything, Brent.
Yeah, so for example, the O'Brien Canal, I actually believe in the 2013 flood that it took most of the water, and it did not actually flood. But there'll probably be a time when the O'Brien Canal is completely full, and if we have a flood, then that will be the issue. But I think in the 2013 flood, it actually took our stormwater to Bar Lake.
So in our next section, are you going to explain how the options for solving the problem?
Yes, I will.
So I guess just to kind of redirect, is retention something that we want to continue to have in the city? Just knowing that some of the industrial areas, they're really not going to be able to develop without retention or some kind of retention. And that kind of gets into Andrew's next thing about the pump drainage.
Yeah.
In order to meet the state drain times, we're having folks actually pump their retention ponds in the interim until we can get an outfall. And so that kind of ties into what Andrew's going to be covering next.
Absolutely, Brent. And what I would suggest that the council maybe consider is a policy where, you know, retention of stormwater beyond the allowable limits, you know, allowed by the state engineer's office will not be allowed without water rights. And, you know, that way people can still do retention if they need to. They'll just need to obtain the water rights to do it legally. And, you know, and I mean, there are some other issues with retention related to flooding and other things, but I think just as a, you know, a bare minimum policy should be that you have to comply with the state law for water rights for these facilities. And then I think, as Brent said, the next topic, pump drainage, really fits into this because I think it provides a temporary workaround to allow these facilities to meet the state engineer's office requirements. So, well, if everybody's ready, we can move on to the next section, and we can obviously talk about retention some more as we get there.
Councilwoman Noble, did you have another question before we move on?
I did. Would you please, just for anyone who might be listening, I do understand why water rights are an issue, but could you help explain why water rights are even relevant when it comes to water simply flooding a retention pond, why it needs to disappear or go somewhere?
I sure will, and thanks. That's a really good question. You know, Colorado has what's called kind of a first in time, first in right policy for water rights. It's called the prior appropriation system. And that means that the first person to claim a water right has the right to use that water, and anybody that comes after them, you know, they can take whatever is left and use it. But so, you know, it's a seniority system. So the older your water right is, the more reliably you can receive that water. And a lot of this probably doesn't matter a whole lot, except for when we get into times of drought. And that's when, you know, flow on some of these creeks, or, you know, these drain into the South Platte River. And there are a lot of irrigators that divert down there. And some of them have very old water rights where they'll be able to divert in even the driest years. But there are also a lot of them that have what are called junior water rights, which are much newer. And so what happens when you have a drought year is that people start losing the ability to divert, especially if they have junior water rights. And so the reason this is important for the retention ponds is that some farmer down the river, you know, it could be out near brush or something, you know, they could say, well, I am not able to divert my water in this dry year. And, you know, the Denver metro area and Commerce City and these other places that have retention are storing this water. And what happens when you store that water is that it evaporates and it doesn't make it back to the stream. So, you know, for an acre of pond area, you would be evaporating a little more than an acre foot of water a year, which is a lot of water. And that's water that somebody else downstream has a right to use before Commerce City would have a right to allow it to evapotranspire. And so the way that it works is if you get a water right for a retention pond, what you basically have to do is to find another source of water to put that water that's evaporating from the pond back into the system downstream, you know, and it could be from a ditch or somebody else that owns water rights, but so that you're not depleting the stream of that water that's being evaporated. So I hope that's an okay explanation. I'm not a water rights guru, but I know a little bit about it.
Thank you.
Please proceed.
Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, the next one kind of goes hand in hand with what we were just talking about with the retention issue. And, you know, pump drainage, you know, a lot of places like New Orleans, you know, their whole drainage system relies on pump drainage. And we saw what happened to them when Hurricane Katrina hit. And you know, pump drainage is sometimes a necessary evil. You know, most engineers want to have drainage via gravity. And there are a lot of reasons for that, because it's reliable. You know, gravity always works. If there's a storm, gravity works. If, there's a power outage, gravity works. And, so gravity drainage is really the gold standard for engineering practice. And, but in some cases, pump drainage is unavoidable. I mean, you see it in Denver with underpasses and roadways where you have to do it sometimes, and sometimes it's just inevitable. And so really, as a drainage practice, we like to avoid it when we can, but we also understand that it's a fact of life. And in fact, the ASCE Manual of Practice has a whole chapter on pump drainage that provides good criteria. And there also are some good criteria out there that we can model after for this issue. Now for detention, where this really comes in is that your pump basically acts like an outlet. And, in simple terms, to meet the state engineer's requirements, you need to evacuate any water that you have in a retention pond within 72 hours. And so, normally if we have gravity drainage, we design a nice outlet that is sized hydraulically to drain it over that time. But when we don't, another alternative is to pump it down over that time. And the advantage of pumping is that you can, with enough lift in a pump, you can pump it just about anywhere you want to, but you can, put in piping to the nearest outfall channel. You have to have somewhere to pump to, but this is a way that without gravity drainage that you could satisfy the state engineer's office requirements for water rights. And so we tend to think that this is something that is probably a necessary evil in Commerce City, at least until some outfalls are built. And even then, there will probably be some situations where you need pump drainage. Next slide, please. So, some of the known issues is it requires additional design on the end. It requires additional equipment, and it requires energy. And, all of those are solvable problems. But as Murphy's Law would have it, when you most need a pump drainage system to work is when it's not going to work because you have a storm that knocks out power. And so you really do have to have, extra pumps, which add to cost. You have to have backup power, that adds to costs. And, so it doesn't come without its costs, but if you can't do gravity drainage, it's probably not a bad way to comply with the state engineer's office requirements. For some larger ponds, you could end up with some really big pump stations. I mean, you have to think about some of the retention ponds out there that you drive by in Commerce City and just how big of a pump you need to pump those things dry in 72 hours. And of course, that adds to costs, but everything has a cost. And maintenance, of course, is higher on pump drainage systems than it is on non-pump systems. Next slide, please. And so just like with retention, we've listed a number of the advantages and disadvantages, and it could be used to drain your existing retention facilities below storms and to comply with the state engineer's office. Those are the big advantages. The disadvantages are mainly in terms of not being as reliable as having drainage via gravity and some additional costs. Need for backup power, backup pumps, need for heavy equipment for repair. And you need to be sure that whoever ultimately has responsibility for these ponds is really keeping up with their maintenance, or else you could have a really big flooding problem on your hands if a pond fills up and the pumps don't work when you have a big flood. And you have to have a conveyance finally to discharge your pump to. I mean, you can't just pump it and it doesn't disappear. You have to have something to pump to. So it really doesn't necessarily get around the outfall issue, but what it does help you get around is that 72-hour drain time that the state engineer's office has. And I think with, just knowing the situation in Commerce City with a lot of existing retention ponds, and probably the cost of pump drainage may be less than the cost of obtaining water rights in some of these cases. And so I think this is, in my opinion, a viable practice. It's one that we certainly don't want to promote and encourage, but if it has to be done, it is something. It's an arrow in the quiver is the way that I would put it. Probably not the first one you want to shoot, but when you've exhausted all of your other options, it's a good one to still have in there. Next slide, please. And so, questions for input are also very similar to the last ones. Should we allow pump drainage? Should we have a whole section on pump drainage, or should we refer to, the ASCE Manual of Practice, for example? If someone is going to use pump drainage, do we want to make them go through a variance process? And I tend to think that would be a good idea, just to be sure that they have exhausted every other alternative before they go there. You know, and then some of the other ones you can read through these, but some of these are a little more kind of technical in nature. You know, what types of pumps should be allowed. Some of them work better than others. You know, should all pumps, you know, do you have a preference for diesel versus electric? You know, knowing that electricity can go out, having a diesel backup and a main electric is probably not a bad way to go. And then, you know, what do you do when you don't have an outfall yet? And how can we get money up front from developers to help pay so that maybe when they leave the site and they get their certificates of occupancy, it's a pump drainage system. But, you know, when we do have an outfall in 10 or 20 years, you know, is there still going to be money on hand to convert it? And I think we could really, you know, potentially require the developers to do a lot of that work up front. So that it's not a stranded cost that the city has to pay for down the line and when the developers are long gone, because those can be expensive. And obviously, if you are able to convert to gravity drainage where you have a pump system, it's going to be better for a whole lot of reasons, you know, greater reliability, better flood protection, lower life cycle costs, lower maintenance costs, and all of those things. So, my personal opinion on this, and obviously that's not what matters. What matters is what you all think about this. But my personal opinion is that that I would include this as an option in the manual, but I probably would require a variance process so it's not too easy for people to just go and do it without trying to evaluate the other options first. But if they truly don't have other options and they need to comply with the state requirements for water rights, that this could be a viable solution to do that. If they can afford it. So, so let's see, I think that was the next one. Next slide, I think gets us into, questions and discussion on this topic. So I'll be quiet for a minute and listen to questions from the council.
Councilman Hurst.
This one also might be for Brent, but, you know, identifying those facilities that are not currently in compliance with the state engineer's office or their requirements. Have we done that yet? And if so, is there a cost estimation of what it's going to cost us to get there?
So we know what facilities, I mean, we know a lot of facilities that have retention ponds. It was a practice that Commerce City really relied on probably for the last 30 years. Especially in areas where there was no outfalls. We have not been going out and trying to find areas that are in violation of the state engineer's office. I guess what the state engineer would be the one that would come around and find those ponds. And so that could be a potential problem for the private property owners. I don't think we really have the ability to go on the private property and I guess make them convert their ponds at this point.
Brent, I would agree with what you just said. And I mean, I think if you all had public facilities that were retaining water in excess of 72 hours, you would want to do something about it because they're your facilities. But I think for the private facilities, you know, the liability for that really rests with the landowners. And at some date, they'll probably get a nasty note from the state engineer asking them what they're going to do. But I don't know that we need to go, you know, kicking that hornet's nest if we don't have to, because, you know, that is not, at least, and I'm not an attorney, the city attorney could tell you this, but I don't think that's Commerce City's responsibility. What I think your responsibility is going forward is to have good criteria that will ensure that new facilities that you all are improving would be compatible with the water rights requirements from the state engineer's office. And I think through this manual, you know, we can also provide useful information for private property owners that may need to convert their own facilities. I mean, they could certainly use these criteria if they needed to, but I view it more for the city as an issue of how to move forward instead of, you know, trying to go out and chase down all these private ponds. You know, certainly, you know, if people ask you about them, it would be good to tell them about the water rights, and the public works staff is aware of that and can do that. But I don't think you all necessarily have to be the water rights police for that one.
Thank you.
Good.
Councilwoman Allen Thomas.
Yes, thank you for tonight's presentations. I was just a couple questions. The first question, I was confused, like as far as for the drainage pumps, if one were to break down, do we have enough generators or how would we handle a situation like, say, if we went the drainage pump route? How would we handle, like, is there enough backup generators? Because I'm just thinking, like, when the dog track flooded a few years ago, was there a system, like, say, the drainage pump goes down?
That's an excellent question, Council Member Alan Thomas. And there are good criteria for that in the ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers Manual of Practice. And what good practice is that you need backup pumps and backup power. And so, you know, you basically have a pump that's in use, and for some of these, if they're bigger structures, you might even have a couple of them. You always have to have spare pumps on hand, and that's something that clearly adds to the costs, and you still need to maintain them. You need to be sure they're in good working order, but that is something that we would write into the criteria, and it's well established in criteria. Then in terms of power, you know, that is the other thing. You do need backup power, and in some cases, people will design pumps, you know, that will operate most of the time based on electricity, and all is good and fine until the electricity goes out, and then you need a diesel generator that's there to kick on and provide the power to the pump. So there are ways that you can work around that with backup generators, and that just has to be a part of the criteria, that you have to have backup pumps and you have to have backup power supply, because otherwise you're creating a really an unacceptable flood risk for anybody that lives around there.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm not sure if this is for Andrew or Brent, but currently, you know, at the Greyhound Park site, is that a retention pond there? And is it in the development plan that they are, you know, I know it's in the plans, retention pond, but I mean, will that, if we change, you know, these guidelines, will that be incorporated as well?
So Councilwoman Alan Thomas, the dog track is a detention pond. It's actually part of the core city's drainage system that all goes through Fairfax Park. And so everything in the core site basically drains through Fairfax Park, and that's why it's one of the areas that floods periodically in the city. I believe that Fairfax Pond is maybe a 10-year pond. So the infrastructure in the core part of the city is sized roughly in a 10-year system. So when we get larger storms, that's why Fairfax continues to overtop, as the same with the dog track. So it's an undersized system, and that's why we're trying to get that as one of our CIP projects in the future, is to be able to study Fairfax and to try to get a project to actually build an outfall system that'll drain properly.
Okay.
And the
All right.
project associated with the redevelopment at Mile High Greyhound Park is to enlarge that detention pond and go from whatever size it is now to get up to a 100-year flood.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Councilman Hurst.
That last part that Roger added just answered my question. I knew we paid to add the size of the Mile High Greyhound redevelopment, but I just wanted to make sure it was for coverage of 100-year instead of opposed to the 10-year.
Councilwoman Noble.
Two questions. First, are there solar generators now so that they inherently have backup? They don't rely on the electrical grid?
You know, that's a good question, Council Member Noble, and there are solar powered pumps, but not of the magnitude we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about serious pump stations like you'd have for a wastewater lift station. And I don't think, unless you were to buy like a massive battery to store the solar power in, kind of the type of thing Xcel Energy does, that you'd be able to power these types of pumps off of solar. It's just they're real high capacity pumps, because you're storing, you know, in most of these ponds, dozens of acre feet of water that you need to evacuate over 72 hours. So you're really pumping on the order of tens, if not hundreds of cubic feet per second, whereas most of the solar powered pumps that I'm aware of are on the order of gallons per minute.
And this may just be to the fact that I'm new. This is my first year. So I'm looking for the context as to why there is an imperative now for this discussion when we're moving into a statewide drought, or are actually in a statewide drought.
And that's a good question. And I think that, you know, part of the answer to that is that water rights become more precious in a drought, you know, and people pay more attention to water rights and to, you know, illegal storage of water that's leading to consumptive losses when you're in a drought state. But this has been the state law for decades. I mean, I don't even know how far back it goes. It's just that until maybe about 5 years ago or so, the state engineer just kind of turned a blind eye to it, and it was kind of a don't ask, don't tell policy. And then they started asking questions, you know, well, what about the water rights for these? And the flood district actually went through a really detailed process, and we helped them with it to demonstrate that you could store water for 72 hours and you're not going to injure the downstream water rights. And so they went and actually participated in this state legislation and rulemaking and provided a lot of input, because for a while it looked like the state engineer wasn't even going to allow you to have detention ponds that hold water like that, because technically even storing water for 72 hours is storing it out of priority. You don't have a right to do that. But we were able to show, working with the flood district, that really the evaporative losses over a 72-hour period are really no different than the evaporative losses from just regular ground. And so we were able to help support that 72-hour rule being written into state legislation. But it has always been a requirement. It's just that it's never been enforced until, you know, at least not enforced much until a few years ago. And I think it's related to a lot of things, probably not directly related to the drought, but if we do get into an extended drought, you're going to start to see more people looking at these retention ponds, the illegal retention ponds that don't have water rights, and calling them out because they are depleting the stream and taking someone else's water.
Thank you.
Any other questions for this presentation? Seeing none, would like to thank everybody for your time in the presentation. It was very informative.
Excuse me, I think we still have one more topic we were going to cover if we have time, and if not, I'm sure maybe we could come back at another time. I know we probably will run way over our agenda time.
Please proceed.
Okay, I'll be quick about this. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, and the next slide. So this last topic, I just wanted to talk real quick about the policy chapter. And after the two kind of controversial, kind of mind-boggling topics we just talked about, this one's pretty straightforward and simple. And, you know, we're developing a policy chapter that addresses a lot of these different topics we've just talked about, principles, policies. You know, we get into, this is where we would have the policy on retention, the policy on pump drainage. But what I really want to talk about is kind of how we're developing criteria for flood control detention. You know, that's kind of the 100-year event and the 10-year event level, and then for stormwater quality facilities. Next slide, please. And so this flow chart, which I will promise you I will not read you all of, is in your packet, and you can spend a little more time looking at this. But what we have done is, you know, the old Commerce City Manual, or the one that we're starting with that's currently in place right now, it does have criteria for detention, but it has very little in terms of criteria for water quality. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, you know, the city has a municipal separate stormwater system permit that they have to comply with. And as a result of that, you have to address water quality, at least for sites that disturb more than an acre of land. And what this flow chart really shows is right now, Commerce City in the manual has a requirement that if you have more than 10,000 square feet of impervious area, that you have to provide flood control detention. And that's a good policy, and we don't want to change that. We think that one should stay just as it is. But what we have built into this is that now with the MS4 permit is that you also have to provide stormwater quality treatment if you hit that threshold. And, you know, the MS4 permit itself does not require treatment until you get to 1 acre. But we have worked with many, many municipalities, including Denver, Greenwood Village. I'm trying to think of a few others right off the top of my head. Some of them up in the mountains too, that really like to kind of sync up their detention practices and their water quality practices, because quite often one pond can do both of those things. You don't have to build 2 separate facilities. And so what we're proposing here is really in line with what the current threshold is of 10,000 square feet for detention. And we would suggest adopting criteria that apply that same threshold for water quality. And there are a few reasons that's important. You know, a lot of the sites, especially in the commercial, or not commercial, but the older areas of Commerce City, are redevelopment sites. And they're all going to be less than an acre. And many of them may even be less than 10,000 square feet. But if you really want to have any kind of meaningful improvements to water quality, or at least to not backslide on water quality conditions, you know, you need to figure out a way to regulate some of those redevelopment sites that may not reach that acre threshold. And that is really what this would provide to do. And there are a lot of different ways you can satisfy the water quality requirements. And this decision tree really just kind of helps to guide people to the best way to address that. But we think it makes a lot of sense to have synced up detention and water quality requirements. We think that these new criteria will enable you all to comply with your MS4 permit easily. And we think that this really should not be a very hard sell to the development community, since they're already required to build the detention anyway at this level, and the water quality can be incorporated within that fairly easily using what we call full spectrum detention, which is kind of the new way of doing detention and water quality all together. And that's something that we're helping to write into the manual too. So we don't think that this would result in really big changes or significantly increased costs, but it would result in improvements in water quality, and it would give you all the ability to comply with the MS4 permit. Next slide, please. And so really that's, you know, what we're looking for in this policy chapter is some improved readability and clarity. That's kind of where the flow chart comes in. You know, most developers want to know, what do I have to do? And so we're trying to give them an easy way to figure that out. It also improves consistency with the current Mile High Flood District criteria, and it will improve consistency with the MS4 permit that you have to comply with. Next slide. And so really that's it for that section. And I promised you it would be short and not quite as mind-boggling as the other ones, but I'd be glad to answer questions if any people have it on that section as well.
Yeah, I do have a question for the mayor and city council. What are your feelings about continuing to allow retention and allowing a pump system in order to meet the state water rights?
Any input, Councilman Hurst?
I mean, sounds like we have situations that if we don't allow some type of pump system, I mean, we're going to have to tear up roadways and railroads and all of that to be able to create that system. And the feasibility of that, just from a cost perspective, it's not feasible. And so trying to find a way where we can compromise, and I'm not saying compromise safety or anything like that. I'm just saying there are ways that we were just told that we can allow these systems to be developed or redeveloped to be able to be in compliance. Obviously, as we move forward on developing, you know, farmland into developable land, we want to have these systems in place. But when we're looking at some of these older infrastructures, I think we should be looking for feasibility and factor in cost with that. And so, you know, even on private property, because all of those things, you know, private property, if it's any large size, will affect its neighbors and so we have the interest in that there. So from my perspective, you know, retentions should be probably our very last use that we have there. And pumps should be before that. And I understand the costs associated with pumps. I understand the maintenance and long-term effects, but the reason that 72-hour rule is there is for good reason. It's because of weather patterns that we experience from time to time in Colorado, just like in 2013. You know, it does have to be the perfect storm, but it's more than once we've seen a perfect storm here. And so, you know, it's a week of storms, or, you know, several weeks of storms that end up adding up and really causing these issues. And so I'd say getting in front of that, you know, there's a much bigger picture that we all have to see on this one. Of, we understand the costs are there, but doing it right the first time will be less costly than cleaning up the mess afterwards.
Any other input to Mr. Sutherland's question? Seeing none, we'll proceed.
Thank you all for the opportunity to speak to the council. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for your attention and your time.
Thank you, and thank you for your time as well and for the information that you provided this evening. Next on the agenda is a citywide retail analysis. Will Economic Development Director Michelle Claymore please make the presentation?
Thank you, Mayor Huisman. Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and City Council members. So Commerce City contracted with KP Consulting and Associates to provide technical assistance towards the city's retail attraction efforts. Katie Press is the founder and principal, and KP Consulting's scope of work with Commerce City includes sharing the top retail attraction practices with staff and City Council in a retail overview, review the city's retail environment, identify appropriate retail nodes in the city, and identify specific retail developers and or businesses for the city to target. Ms. Press provided City Council with an in-depth reference guide on the retail industry and how retailers make location decisions. She presented an overview of the reference guide during the study session on July 27th. Ms. Press is also doing a citywide retail analysis, and during this second study session tonight, she will present information on the city's 2 trade areas and the types of retail she feels will be successful for attraction efforts. Katie Press has been in the retail real estate business for 35 years and most recently providing consulting services for both retailers and local municipalities in Colorado. Over the last 20 years, she has done consulting work for many of the municipalities within the Metro Denver area. And prior to that was vice president for Catellis Commercial Group, real estate manager for Safeway stores, and a real estate representative for 7-Eleven stores. Dylan, if you wouldn't mind pulling up her presentation, we will begin. And Katie, you, I think, are on live now.
Yeah. Are we good to go?
Yep.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. We'll go ahead and just jump right in if that's okay with everybody. I believe everybody received the actual Commerce City Retail Review, and hopefully you all have had a chance to review it, and I'm sure we're going to have questions at the end this time. First up, just as a reminder that the scope of work has been broken down into 3 different steps. The first one, which I came to you at the end of July with, was basically an educational component about retailing. The second, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, was a citywide retail review. And then step 3 is actual chase or initiation or contact with retailing as it pertains to what we're trying to recruit to the city of Commerce City. Next slide. So step 1, just as a quick reminder, was laying the groundwork. That insider's look at retail provided that in-depth understanding of retailing concepts, starts to talk about trade area dynamics and trends, and it's a necessary groundwork in becoming a relevant partner to the retailing community. Next step, or next slide, sorry. So again, we equate this to a funnel. We started broadly and we're now moving down to where we get towards the bottom of the funnel. I would say this is the middle of the funnel where we're really looking at a lot of aspects in more detail. Step 3 really gets us down to the bottom of the funnel where we're really actually dealing with what can be accomplished in terms of retailing within the city. Next slide. Just working our way to the bottom. So, you know, we're working our way from the top to the bottom in terms of knowledge. It's a necessary step to understand what our opportunities are. Retail is not a scattershot exercise. We don't just load the shotgun and start shooting at things to see what will potentially we can hit. We really need to delve into the trade areas and identify its shortcomings and opportunities. In some cases, we may have to fix some of our shortcomings in order to be more attractive. And it also helps to set the appropriate expectations. So when we're talking to the retailing community, we're giving a level of expertise and knowledge and education that identifies us as somebody that's worthwhile for them to engage with. Next slide. So really when we look at Commerce City, this really breaks itself down into two trade areas as it pertains to retailing. The wildlife refuge plays an important part in defining those retailing opportunities. It is a distinctive and identifiable barrier between the north and the south. I don't think that's surprising to anybody who's involved with Commerce City. And those two distinctive trade areas are something that the retailing community recognizes as well. Next slide. So what defines a trade area? And, you know, this is a lot of times something that's a little more, feels somewhat esoteric sometimes, in the sense that, you know, what does it mean to have a trade area for a retailer? And it's really that geographical area that a retail store draws from. And as consumers, we all have a certain idea of how far we're willing to drive to make certain purchases. It's not the same for every retail purchase. It's different. The length of drive, or the time we will take to get to a particular retailing destination changes based on what the type of retail we are actually pursuing. Other factors that are considered when we're defining a trade area is the demographic makeup, competitive influences, so sister stores or competitors that may impact it, and then barriers to accessibility. Next slide. So do retailers really pay attention to trade areas? This is kind of something that when we talk about within our industry, obviously we do. When we talk about it outside of the industry, I get a lot of questions about it. The fact is, the trade area characteristics and criteria is the most important factor for retailers in site selection. When we talk about it in the private sector, about what are retailers willing to do or where there are gaps within their store system, we start with a ring map. Just like we saw on the slide before, ring maps are still extremely relevant in the retailing industry, and it really helps to identify whether or not we have gaps within a particular trade area or trade areas as we're evaluating where we would like to go from a retailing perspective. So it is vitally important. They pay a lot of attention to it, and because they pay a lot of attention to it, we have to pay a lot of attention to it. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the Northern Range first. And so this is just a quick introductory slide. So let's talk about what's working in the Northern Range. And I'm not going to spend tonight going through each of the individual retailing. I'm happy to do that when we get to the questions. But for time's sake and kind of getting through the material, we are not going to go through by retailing sector each of the factors that pertain to either the Northern Range or the core city. Next slide. So what's working? We have the beginnings of an established residential base, and that's important because that residential base is something that is on somewhat of the radar screen of some levels of retailing. Some it is not, because we haven't reached full maturity from that perspective. We have strong demographics with desirable elements to retailers in the north. We have strong average household incomes, average household sizes. There's nothing within the demographics that I think is a red flag to retailers. E470, which is working for us, it provides high visibility sites along the parkway. And as we have talked about some of the larger scales of retailing, that visibility and accessibility to something like an E470 is an extremely important component. There's opportunity for additional growth to further substantiate the trade area, and that's significant. We're not built out, we're not landlocked, and we're not in a situation where we don't have zoning to allow for additional growth that would help in terms of attracting some of the larger scale of retailing. Convenience retailing has established themselves in the trade area, not surprising. They're usually the first to show up, as their criteria is the most lenient if we look at it from that perspective. And independent restaurateurs have discovered the area, and that again is also positive. Next slide. What's challenging? So the residential density is not deep enough yet for many of the retailers or restaurateurs. The fact that we've had independent restaurateurs show up is certainly positive, but when you start moving into national chain retailing and restaurateurs, you get more rigidity in terms of what they look for in terms of a trade area characteristic. And we don't quite meet that. We're not at the threshold that meets a number of those criteria. And so that density has to get deeper. The trade area lacks the presence of non-retail commercial. So it's kind of one note. It's not kind of, it is one note. It's residential in its perspective. And for some scale of retailing, especially grocery stores and the convenience retailing, that's been just fine. But if we want to see a broader breadth of retailing interest in the north, we're going to have to bring some of the non-retail commercial to the table, specifically hospitality, office, potentially entertainment. You know, as I tell Michelle, you know, getting the sports park under construction is a big component because it signifies a depth to a trade area that is currently missing. One of the things that we can't change is how DIA acts as a barrier keeping the trade area from expanding fully to the east for larger scale retailing. That's been a pretty big factor for us, and it's one of the reasons that we've seen perhaps some of the larger scale retailing that we might have liked to have attracted really kind of shift down further to the south of us because they're not limited by DIA and the way that it bifurcates the trade area. And that's going to be a challenge that we have throughout. We can't fix that dynamic necessarily. And it will have a limiting factor on what retailing actually looks at the northern range. Retail competitive influences exist on the periphery. And I know that there's been some debate, at least it's been communicated to me that there's been debate within the city about, you know, are they really competitive influences? And the answer is yes, based on certain scales of retailing and how we look at this. So, you know, when we look at Prairie Center, it's within the view of the northern range, and right now they're siphoning or taking away the, you know, those sales into from the northern range into Prairie Center, and those retailers see the northern range as part of their trade area dynamics for serving this area. So those competitive influences definitely have an impact. Those impacts can be mitigated by additional growth within in the north. And as we try to attain what I would call more of a freestanding trade area associated with the northern range versus having to use support from development that's outside of the city. So next slide. So I kind of like to give some pictures, and so we're here. We're attractive. We look good. Looks like a nice outing. Unfortunately for retailers, next slide, they want us to be here. They don't care that, you know, we're not as quite as attractive as before. They're really looking for a larger population density in the northern range for a number of the scales of retailing that we're still trying to attract to the northern range. Next slide. So the northern range trade area has reached enough capacity to support basic convenience and needs-based retailing. And needs-based retailing is King Soopers. It's the ancillary retailer, small-scale retailing that has gone in along with King Soopers and in the area of King Soopers. We've reached enough capacity to support that level of retailing. Additional trade area growth is the #1 factor affecting many of the retailing segments and their perception of the trade area. Currently, the retailing community assesses the northern range as interesting, but not big enough yet. And I heard that as a consistent feedback from some of the larger retailing concepts that we would like to see in the northern range. Next slide. So, you know, is 104th corridor the lone opportunity? If you read through each of the sectors of retail, you heard a lot of conversation about 104th. You know, the East 104th Avenue corridor is the first to develop in the northern range. It's centrally located within the trade area, which extended with extended reach from E470 to I-25. So this corridor has everything it needs to attract retail, which is why it was the first to develop. Retail came there first because it provided the best opportunity to deliver customers to the retailing that was built along the 104th corridor. No other corridor, be it Highway 85, East 120th, or East 96, has all of those attributes of the East 104th Avenue, and that limits their appeal to retailing. So as we talk to retailers about entering the Northern Range, and we may not be meeting all of their criteria, they're going to want to mitigate risk in a growth area by not moving to corridors that can't quite deliver in the same capacity that 104th is. And I think in the short term, in the next 3 to 4 or 5 years, you're going to see continued interest on the 104th corridor. And I don't see a situation necessarily where I think those other corridors are going to become nearly as attractive. And you know what, and bottom line is those other corridors just don't measure up, which means retail's going to continue to focus their attention on the East 104th Avenue corridor. And if we talk about whether or not 85, 120th, or 96th have the capacity to mature into 104th, I would tell you, you know, the challenges with 120th is that it's a shortened corridor in comparison to 104th. And as we move up to the north on 120th, we start running into I-76, and we start running into a trade area that starts to get cut off. And that's a factor that I think retailing is really going to resist against in terms of seeing 120th Avenue as a viable retailing corridor anytime in the near future. Highway 85 always has been and will continue to be, at least in the short term, viewed as a transportation corridor. I don't think retailing doesn't really evaluate the Highway 85 corridor as a corridor that is coalesced from a residential perspective and one that feels attractive to them in terms of location. And 96 suffers from some of the same issues that 120th does. The further south you go, the more you run into the wildlife refuge, what cuts off the trade area dynamics for East 96. So the bullseye is going to continue to be the 104th corridor. When I spent time talking to a lot of the retailers, there was no interest really in these alternative corridors. All interest is really focused on the 104th corridor. Next slide. So kind of a frustrating answer, right? So what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to just sit around and wait, right? And as frustrating as an answer as that is, when it really comes to more dining options and larger scaled retailing options, the answer is yes. You're going to have to just wait. But while we're waiting, there are elements that the city can engage in that's going to enhance the opportunities within the Northern Range. So it's not like we just sit on our hands and do nothing. There are things that can be done that further make that the Northern Range an attractive trade area, especially for those larger dining options and larger scaled retailing. Next slide. Planning and visioning, and I know cities get tired of hearing about this, but I can't tell you how important it really is within the retailing arena. You know, planning and visioning ensures that different sectors of retail will have sites appropriate to their characteristics. What that means is that we're not skewed to developing retail in one sector above and beyond somebody else. And it's easy to have smaller retailing options come in and kind of suck up site opportunities within a corridor. And then when we finally reach a level of maturity where larger scale retailing wants to come in, some of those sites are then gone. And so it's really important that we're planning and visioning that corridor so that we have left opportunity for the retailing base to grow appropriately as the area matures. And if these future opportunity sites are eaten up, you know, these sites can end up unusable long-term, you know, precluding the later to arrive retail from entering the Northern Range. And this is always the challenge in a growth area. You know, there's that balance between getting enough services that you feel like you're making some progress on the retailing front, but at the same time, you're maintaining the ability to do larger retailing opportunities that only show up after there's a certain level of maturity. Next slide. So patience. Exercising patience to let some of these sites stay undeveloped until non-convenience retailers become attracted to the Northern Range. As you've seen already, the Commerce City in the Northern Range has had no problem figuring out how to do convenience retail. It's pretty well represented along the corridor. What we're waiting for and hoping to mature into is deeper retailing opportunities that have more options than we're presently offering, and those are not going to be necessarily in the convenience factor. They're going to be things into alternative types of grocers, perhaps more intricate mixed use opportunities that really have some more interesting retailing options that come along with it. Retail growth for growth's sake is not a sustainable approach to retailing. The city needs to become more selective as the area grows to ensure that there's a broader mix and scale and type of retail can be represented as the market matures. When you have a corridor that is all convenience based, those are auto-centric corridors that really don't have a lot of retailing interest. We can only do so much on the fast food and convenience side basis, and we really need to have some patience, to exercise some patience to be able to attract and mature into some better retailing options. Next slide. So is it worth the wait? If the city develops a sound retailing vision and is willing to be patient, what exactly are the opportunities within the Northern Range? Next slide. So first and foremost, an opportunity to round out our convenience-based dining options. Fast casual restaurants are missing from the entire corridor. Interestingly enough, they're missing from a great deal of the area, even the broader area. We don't really even see these guys showing up within Prairie Center. So I think there's definitely opportunity. These guys are a little more picky than, let's say, a McDonald's or a Burger King or a Taco Bell. But I think that we have opportunity to mature into allowing these guys to come in, provided that we've left opportunity for them to find, appropriate development sites. Next slide. Opportunity to complement our independent and convenience restaurant tours with national chain casual dining. I think to have really a full spectrum restaurant component, you need to have both. Independent restaurants are certainly the backbone of the industry. They're the backbone of a lot of communities. Commerce City is not different in that regard. But I think that, consumers definitely still are attracted to some national chain restaurant components. And I think allowing ourselves an opportunity for them to come into the marketplace is definitely warranted. Next slide. Opportunity to bring an alternative grocer to Commerce City. So I definitely think there's an opportunity to do this. It's purely a numbers game at this point. They are looking for residential maturity, have a lot of conversation in the marketplace about, how do we get Sprouts? How do we get natural grocers? And it really comes down to having an appropriate site when the market has reached the level of maturity that they can come into. Next slide. Opportunity to have Walmart move forward and with a Walmart Supercenter. I do believe Walmart is intent on holding on to the real estate at this point in time. I do think that they're having a forward eye towards developing a super Walmart in the Commerce City area. I know they've come left, still on their dirt. I understand that, but I would tell you that today's perspective is that they still see this as an opportunity. It's a hole for them. It fits nicely with the existing store in Brighton. And so what they're waiting for, again, is residential maturity. So they just need to see our trade area mature somewhat from a residential perspective. And I think the opportunity for Walmart to move forward is definitely there. Next slide. And then an opportunity to bring Sam's Club. If we sit now, I have to add some caveats to this because Sam's Club has had some, roller coaster years in terms of development and their growth, and they've closed stores and then they have come back and built some stores, and then they've been somewhat slow. And I would say in the last few years of developing new stores for Sam's Club. But they like to pair with Walmart. They like to be in the same trade area with a Walmart Supercenter. Ideally, they'd like to be in the same parking lot with them. If that's not feasible, I do think that they like to be in proximity. And so if we look at where the club stores are and where we're going to have gaps, Sam's Club is definitely a gap in this area. And given the propensity for the new Walmart Supercenter, I think it definitely opens the door for Sam's Club to take a look at this upon maturity of the trade area. And to be fair, when we talk about Sam's Club and Costco, their population base needed to support a store is pretty significant. And so they're definitely going to be looking at not just Commerce City, but also the growth area within Denver to the south of us and to Brighton to the north of us to help bring that trade area into alignment with what they need to support a store. Next slide. This to me is probably the most interesting opportunity that I think that we have in Commerce City, and that's opportunity for a lifestyle or mixed use center that includes entertainment, unique restaurants, and retail opportunities as part of the mix of development. Now, we have some of that trying to go on south of us down I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of the station right now off the top of my head, but we're seeing aspects of it, but we haven't really seen what I would say a full commitment to it. Prairie Center in no way, shape, or form is a lifestyle center. It is pure power retailing in its finest glory. If you talk to them, they would like to tell you that they're more of a lifestyle center than they are pure power retailing, but they really don't fit that criteria in any way, shape, or form. And so I think we have an opportunity, if we're capitalized off of the interchange at E470 and 104th, to really bring something that's more unique to the area. Now, make no mistake, this is not coming anytime in the near future. This is not 3 years away. This is easily 5 years away, depending on how fast residential growth happens in the Northern Range and other factors that may come into play, like the introduction of some sort of office component or other types of daytime uses that might come in and help flesh out the Northern Range. But there's definitely a hole in the area for this type of a shopping center to come on board. And I think that we have a good case to make with the E470 and the 104th interchange, that this type of development could actually have some legs, as we say in the industry. Next slide. So what happens if you're not patient? So immature trade areas attract only basic retailing. We've seen that. We're experiencing that on the 104th corridor. But much like a weed, if we let that scale of retail run rampant throughout the growth area, we're possibly choking out sites that could play a more meaningful role later on. And there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, and too much convenience-based retailing is not a good thing for a growth-focused trade area that needs to mature into deeper retailing options. And I think, go ahead and give me the next slide. What we're trying to avoid is this. And even if we take all the power lines out and we just look at, we have just the straight run of really convenience-based retailing. And we want to get to something that's a little more intricate and I would say deeper in terms of retail perspective. And the only way to do that is to exercise patience in the Northern Range. So before I jump into the South, into the core city, would you guys like to ask questions about the North?
Any questions at this time regarding the Northern Range? I think we'll wait until towards the end to ask our questions.
Okay, let's talk about the core. Next slide. Next slide. So what's working in the core? And make no mistake, the core is completely a different conversation than the Northern Range is. So, you know, what's working? Basic retailing services are being provided with some amount of choice. It's not, you know, you don't just have one, you have some opportunity to choose. It's established and a stable residential base. I mean, you know what you've got. And it has established and stable retailing pockets. There's some opportunity for limited retailing growth in the Victory Crossing development. So that presents, you know, something that's more unusual for established areas. And that's a new project with new opportunity. I guess new would be a relative term as it comes to the Victory Crossing. Has strong demographics with desirable elements to retailers. I know that there's sometimes some question about that, but the demographics are decent, and I don't think that they're prohibitive. There's long-term independent restaurateurs who've been in existence throughout the core city for a long time, and there's no guessing about the core. You know what you have. Unlike the Northern Range, where there's a lot of guessing, in the core we don't have any guessing. Next slide. So what's challenging? So the core city's been bracketed by bigger retailing projects, which has really eliminated the core city from capturing that scale of retailing, including within Victory Crossing. So if we look at, yeah, I know that there have been attempts throughout the, you know, probably what, the last decade or more within Commerce City to revisualize or capture some retailing of different scale within the core. And, you know, really those efforts have been stymied by the advent of development that's happened to the south and to the east of the core. And this is where demographics may be of some type to attract some types of retail or restaurant options. Probably more than anything, it has to do with co-tenancy and other types of retailing options that they chose to locate next to or be part of versus, you know, being independent within the core. The heavy industrial presence is significant, and that can be a hindrance to retail. Retail does not see synergy with heavy industrial. They don't look at the labor pool or the people working in the area and see that as a value add. You know, they're really focused in on, you know, pure residential type of numbers, and the industrial to them feels like it stymies the ability of the residential within, in terms of numbers within the core. And it lacks presence of other types of non-retail commercial. Again, we're missing that hospitality, office. We have a soccer stadium, so you have some level of entertainment, but interestingly, in my conversations with folks, nobody saw the soccer stadium as something that they felt was necessarily a driver for the retail that we might have been talking about. Next slide. You know, you Google Commerce City and the images are either a soccer stadium or heavy industrial. And, you know, to be frank with you, that's exactly what the retailing community thinks the core city is. They just don't see the core city as being anything more than these two things. And those two things do not connect to the retailing world. Next slide. In reality, though, the core city is not just those things. And you as stewards of the community and part of the community, you understand that. The retailing community does not understand that. It has an established residential base with hardworking residents. The residents have supported the array of independent retailers that have been doing business in the core city for years. The independent businesses are the backbone of several retailing nodes, which are sprinkled throughout the core city. Next slide. You know, as is the case with any older established area, municipalities look for and try to implement redevelopment. That's common. I mean, I think everybody has that desire that's in a municipality that has older areas. Redevelopment in the core city as it relates to retail is an interesting question. What does that look like? Can retail stand alone in redevelopment efforts? And can these long established retail pockets become opportunities for larger transformations? Next slide. Listen, the meaning of the word established is having been in existence for a long time and therefore recognized and generally accepted. So although the retailing pockets have seen small changes throughout the years, the core city has stayed relatively the same. And any retailing that has wanted or needed to transform within these pockets has done so. Next slide. The retail mountain has not wanted to move. Retailing within the core city is now long established and therefore generally recognized and accepted. Retail's been pretty complacent within the core, and that complacency is a strong indicator that retail will not be a catalytic element for redevelopment. And I know there have been a number of initiatives, both with the racetrack, within Derby and Dana Crawford's plans, and we've not seen movement with that. And, you know, really when you get down to redevelopment, you know, next slide. You're trying to force the market to reconsider the area to be redeveloped, right? You're trying to bring elements into place that would force the market into a different conclusion. And without all of those different efforts, there has not even been an inkling that the retail pockets of the core city would be capable of carrying that kind of redevelopment weight. And, you know, Michelle and I got into an interesting conversation with this because she kind of really challenged me on this assumption. And I said, well, you know, I remember the Plazas de las Americas when it was the Ivy Center and it was an old King Soopers. And, you know, the thought was when Rancho Laborio came in that was going to really help redevelop that pocket. And there was an architectural change to it, and you did have a use change in the sense of user change, in the sense that first Rancho Laborio and now Mi Pueblo. But if you look at that area, nothing else has actually transitioned around it. The little pocket retail that sits out on the periphery of that has not really made any kind of dramatic change in terms of retailing. And so I think that there has been some hope and desire that retail could be a catalytic redevelopment motivator in some of these areas, and the retail has not responded to those efforts. And I don't see anything that changes that perspective when I talk to the retailing community or you look at it from my own retailing perspective. I just don't see what would force the transition. And, you know, I'm going to stand on the position that that's probably accurate, given the fact that after, you know, a number of initiatives, nothing has really made a dramatic change in the retailing in terms of the core city. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either. I just think it's understanding that there is a limitation to what you can expect retail to carry in terms of redevelopment weight as it pertains to the core. So retail is not going to be at the forefront of redevelopment within the core city. You know, it might follow along with a grander redevelopment effort, of which retail is not the focus. Maybe it's residential, maybe it's something that, you know, we haven't anticipated yet. But even with those kinds of efforts, I think retail will only play a part, and more than likely, and perhaps only a small part at that. Next slide. So what is the focus in the core city then? Well, we need to work to retain the existing retailers, especially ones that play a larger role. And maintaining services or basic needs-based retailing within the core is important. Having selection and opportunity to choose where you'd like to shop, be it Mi Pueblo or King Soopers or Super Walmart. You know, I think that you want that complement of needs-based retailing. I'm going to tell you, you've got one of these guys who's probably, you know, not doing well enough and may actually leave the corridors or may leave the trade areas. So I think working to retain that retailer or those retailers is especially important. Next slide. Making small incremental changes to the existing retail base. And sometimes I wonder if, you know, by thinking bigger in the particular case of the core, we've lost a little bit of the trees for the forest. And so it may be something where we need to go back and really just focus on on individual trees, hoping that over time we're going to see more of a change within the overall quote unquote forest. Next slide. Okay, so coming to grips with the retail development reality associated with Victory Crossing. I'm sure you guys loved my piece about what's the deal with Victory Crossing. I heard that from just about every retailing contact I reached out to. There is no, in the retailing arena, including the person who lists a portion of the site for the Kroenke Group, or for Kroenke Sports, or I'm not even sure which entity plays with it anymore. There isn't a clear understanding of what the objective is anymore. There once was, you know, when the soccer stadium was coming into existence, there was certainly very aggressive retailing plans and ideas that were associated with Victory Crossing, but too much time has passed and too little has happened for the retailing community to fully understand what, if any, opportunities there are associated with Victory Crossing. And that includes both 56 in Central Park as well as Quebec. I think there's a sense that the city may be unrealistic about what the retailing is feasible for this project, and then understanding that it may be difficult to come to the table and work on something directly with Kroenke. Next slide. So we don't seem to understand the project. That's the bottom line. Is it a grocery site? Is it a town center? Is it hospitality? Is it office? Can you do residential? Is it flex industrial? Is it going to be all of these things? We don't seem to understand what the vision is. And any vision for the project seems to be cloudy and obscure at best to the private sector. Next slide. So we need to get new eyes on the project, along with a healthy dose of realism of what is needed to produce a plan capable of being developed. You know, in the 13 years since Dick's Sporting Goods Park opened, no other non-municipal development has been achieved. This has made the project stale and stagnant from a retailing perspective. If things stay as is, retail development expectations beyond a gas station and fast food restaurants are probably unrealistic. Next slide. So, final thoughts. You know, every market area, trade area, and city has some sort of retailing limitation. You know, no city is unique. No city is spared from having retail limitations. It would be a rare and unique city that can support all of their retailing desires. I can't even think of one off the top of my head. That's how hard that is. Many municipalities want to ignore these limitations, and you know, they'll spend a lot of hours and resources and time chasing opportunities that are not going to materialize. So, you know, accepting the limitations and focusing on where opportunities do lie within the community is key to a successful retail economic development effort. Next slide. There's an equal amount of discussion within this report as to where retail limitations exist for Commerce City as well as opportunity. So, you know, it's not all one way or the other. It's not all rosy and it's not all negative. It's you know, we have both opportunities and limitations. Next slide. So even though this review, you know, exposes areas where retailers are going to say no, I want to make sure you understand no is not a negative connotation in the retail world. It just means the opportunity is not a match. In the private sector, every developer, shopping center owner, and broker deals with trade area limitations that bring no from retailers. I mean, that's just part of our business. In fact, no is just as often to be heard as yes. And the private sector, we don't dwell on those. You know, we dwell on what's an appropriate scale and retailer makeup for a project, because our goal is to get something that is going to be sustainable and can be built. And we will pivot focus when needed to retailers that can be landed either now or into the future. Next slide. Municipalities that are successful in retailing recruitment, they understand this dynamic and embrace the opportunities that are there for them. So next slide. So next steps. So now we know what we are looking for and where we need to place our focus. We're going to now develop more understanding of the individual sites and what is needed to attract our targets, including where we need to have patience. That's not done separately. That's usually done in connection with reaching out directly to the retailers that we think are targets for those particular sites, and developers directly regarding those site opportunities. And we start to seed the opportunity. So in the north, where we're talking about having patience and we're waiting for certain factors to come into maturation in order for us to capitalize, you still need to be on everybody's radar screen, right? They need to know where we're heading. They need to know what our growth factors are, how fast we're absorbing residential, when the site might be ready for them, and, you know, and making sure that we have the right site set aside for them and seeding those opportunities. So getting it on their radar screen, have them start looking at it, put it in front of them on a somewhat regular basis to get them aware of where those opportunities are at. So I think that's kind of a quick run through. We didn't take too long with that. So I'm sure we have questions, at least I hope we do. So I'm happy to answer any questions for anybody.
Questions from council regarding this? Councilman Wadiola?
Thank you, Mayor. And again, thank you to everyone that put that presentation together and the information that they sent out to us before that. I think I guess this is more of a comment to staff. Reading the information and now listening, one thing that I think, to be patient, what we could do is still tell our story. Like, you know, when I read the packet and what comes up is Suncor and the Rapid Stadium, right? For the South, for the core, I mean, we have old existing retail, we have residentials that are historic there. They don't know that. They're not seeing that. So if they Google it, look at what they're looking at. And in the north, she just said it, you know where we're going. They could, for all reasons, just think it's going to be farmland. So I think something that council and staff could really look into is, while we're being patient and being selective and waiting for those opportunities, is really tell the story of Commerce City, where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going. I think that's something that we could definitely start doing. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem?
So to piggyback on what Councilmember Guardiola just said, you know, one thing that, like, I've done at, not myself personally, but that our company's done is to actually fix like how we come up when people Google us. And so is that an option to like, basically we ended up doing it through our website. And so I don't know how that all works, and that's like an IT type. But is there a way to better improve what is coming up when people Google us? And that goes right in line with like improving the image of our city. If Suncor, if Suncor is one of the things that come up, what can we do to change our image when people are searching for Commerce City?
I believe the term you're looking for is search engine optimization. There are companies out there that specialize in that.
Yes.
Councilwoman Noble?
This was a really interesting presentation, and it raises a lot of questions, but it also brings up a lot of ideas. I'll piggyback on what Mayor Pro Tem Frank did, just discussed. And frankly, we as a city need to make a decision about who we are and how we want to be viewed. You can do all the search optimization that you want, and it doesn't get rid of the fact that we're seen as a heavy industrial community. And there have been many times when I have brought people to Commerce City who had no idea what it looked like here because of what they see on the news, and of course, when they Google Commerce City. But the news that we are generating is about pollution, bad water, things that are negative that don't help our image whatsoever in any way, shape, or form. On the other hand, with COVID-19, there is an unusual opportunity for Commerce City. And that's because people don't want to live in high rises. They don't want to go to work in skyscrapers. And most of the big retail areas to the south of us are built around that kind of thing. But we don't have to offer that. We can be low-rise office. We provide more bang for the buck when it comes to housing. We have open space and parks. We're freeway accessible, both E470 and I-76. We're very close to DIA, which is really great. We are a transportation hub with two different ways to get to light rail, one of which, of course, is in Commerce City now, and the other is not far away at Pena. If you happen to live up in the north, that might even be closer for some people. When it comes to the south, Rhino, River North area, or Five Points, as it was also known, was actually developed by artists. And they were the ones who first came into that area because it was inexpensive to rent space there. Of course, that area has been changing rapidly in the last few years, and maybe we have an opportunity to actually name part of the core city. Could we name the core city an art district? Could the businesses in the core city form a partnership, like the Downtown Denver Partnership, where they're working together, or a some sort of business association where they're deciding that together they're going to redefine what the core city is and what it is that it offers to the community. Victory Crossing is that's a crazy situation just to start with, because anybody who goes to stadiums always wants something nearby to go to, but they can go into Stapleton fairly easily now, just behind the stadium, and go directly down to the retail and stadium. So that's caused a problem, certainly. But more importantly, as I said, we need to reverse our image in Commerce City, and we need to make a commitment to doing that. I really think that that's critical. I see that in social media all the time. There are people who live in Commerce City who use the word commerce something as a pejorative. And if we're talking that way about our own community, if we're talking that way about our water, if we're talking that way about the pollution in Commerce City, then that's the kind of message that's getting out there to people too. We need to also take a better look at planning. I have talked about this before, that the planned unit development designation is just a giant bucket. And we need to help define, and planning needs to occur so that we're designating areas as opposed to letting anything come in. We're looking at 104th, as Katie was just talking about, in terms of opportunity for the community, but we're doing the whole East End as warehouses. That's what's going in west of Highway 2 is just a whole other set of warehouses. Warehouses and industrial are cheap wins. If we want cheap wins, then that's what we're going to get. If we want to lift all boats in Commerce City and do all we can for Commerce City, then together we need to make a commitment about what we want that vision to look like. And we don't really have time to make that decision by waiting for the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan from 10 years ago outlined what the community wanted for it, and no one acted on that comprehensive plan. It's extremely important for us to do it now. I sound pretty excited about this because I am very excited about it. I'm excited about it because I think there's a lot of opportunity. And if we make good use of our time, as Katie is talking about, then we will be able to attract the things that we want to. The intersection of Tower and 104th is going to be really great. I'm not particularly keen on a Walmart coming in at the corner of Tower and 104th, because that damages the other businesses that we build up on the 104th corridor or otherwise. 120th, I think, does still have an opportunity because a lot of people take that road to get from E470 to 76 from DIA, and we could position that in a different way as well. But there's a lot of opportunity. We're just not investing enough time as a city and as a city council in imagining what opportunities there are and how we can make them happen. Thank you.
Would staff like to respond to that?
Roger, I don't know if you want to jump in with any comments. There's been a lot that has been brought up. Of course, tonight we're trying to focus on the retail piece, but a lot of these comments kind of deal with bigger issues that do affect the retail attraction piece. I know, Roger, you had brought up to council that potentially setting some money aside to do some kind of visioning and retail planning as it relates to both of these corridors.
Yes, that was set aside in the budget for the visioning. There was a lot in what you said, Councilwoman Noble. Part of it, I don't know if you recognize, but part of it is in conflict with other things that you said, and that is the industrial provides the daytime jobs that are needed for basically some of the retail that we need, as well as offices do that. So, you know, we need an appropriate mix of the various land uses, basically. And so I know there's a conflation of industrial with warehousing. And unfortunately, when you set zoning to cover, for example, if you want to attract manufacturing, you're also going to get distribution that does not provide necessarily the same level of jobs that manufacturing does. The one caution I would give you is that the reason Commerce City has been successful financially is due to the amount of industry and business that we have that's not the traditional retail type of business. So again, you know, you need some of all of those things. And so how you balance that really is the, I think, the $1 million question. So that's a lot of long-winded way of answering. Yes, we have money set aside for visioning, and I think it would be appropriate next step for council to be talking about what do you want Commerce City to look like and feel in the coming years.
Industrial isn't keeping Highway 85 afloat, though. It's not keeping King Soopers and Walmart. It's not attracting Panera Bread. It's not attracting any of the fast casual that we're talking about. The kind of people who go to those sorts of restaurants are usually office workers. So low-rise office would make perfect sense. But we have to make that decision. Are we going to continue to have industrial, or are we going to take a stand and say, you know what, we need to change the game here and attract other kinds of businesses that will provide support for the residents who are living here and are demanding us to come up with opportunities for them that they're seeking, because we're making it an area that they don't feel that they want to live in, because there aren't the retail and restaurant and entertainment opportunities for them that they thought were promised when they first moved to Commerce City even 15 years ago or 20 years ago. Now, if I'm conflating anything, I would be conflating the core city and the north. But it's hard to talk about both simultaneously. But visioning, I think, is incredibly important. And I hope that we can get on that as soon as possible. It will help all of us a great deal.
Councilman Hurst.
Yeah, I agree with the vision, but that we have to make a good vision, but we also have to know where we're good and where we're located. You know, homes, we lose money on every single home. So unless we're ready to change our entire tax structure, we're going to have to create a balance. So, you know, we're just told you need rooftops, you need density, so you need multifamily, you need single family homes, you need all of the above. None of those get police services or anything like that without a good commercial or industrial base that's paying the taxes. Low-rise businesses or low-rise office space don't generate the same type of sales and use tax that an industrial business does. And yeah, you'd be bringing in tax revenue, but for the same space, you'd be losing revenue by allowing that type of development. And so understanding where we're at from a regional perspective too is very important. You know, I hear what all of our residents say about driving 20 minutes to everything. And I live here. I mean, I feel that too at times, depending on what we're looking for. But at the same time, and the people that I know don't necessarily look at Commerce City the way that all of you guys have described it. You know, one of the things that I'm the most proud of Commerce City is the amount of blue collar jobs that we have. You shut down Commerce City today, the entire state in every single corner feels it tomorrow in their supply chains. Having 250 transportation related businesses in our city that's our strength. That's what we need to continue building upon. And we've talked about this in the past where, you know, we talk about why can we only get warehousing? Why can we only get trucking? Because all of the support businesses that are needed for those businesses to be successful are also here. And so if you need to change your windshield in your truck and you want to build your trucking company in Boulder or Louisville, you're going to have to pay a transportation fee from Commerce City up to Boulder or Louisville. And so the cost of doing business therefore increases because your support businesses are all in Commerce City. And all of those support businesses generate invoices that we collect taxes off of for sales and use tax. And so finding that correct balance where you're not feeling like you're living in an industrial zone, but understanding the need to generate those types of, or what those types of businesses bring to our city, and realizing where we fit from a regional perspective. Everybody, especially during the pandemic, loves their next day, same day delivery. That's not possible without a place like Commerce City, not even close to being possible. And if we don't do it, Aurora's going to do it, Brighton's going to do it, and Adams County's going to do it, because that is a daily generation of hundreds of invoices. And that's how we collect taxes and support the revenue to run our city. And so if we continue to build houses without a balance, we're going to continue to look at shortages in public safety funding. We're going to continue to look at shortages on building the future infrastructure and water projects that we need, because we're not going to have tax generating businesses that actually support the vision that we see. And so having that type of balance, whether it's, you know, some type of future business that we're not seeing today, is something that has to be considered, because just having houses and parks and, you know, office buildings sounds great, but we'll be the poorest city in the metro area because we won't be able to generate the income that's needed to run our municipality. And so without owning our water district, without owning some of the resources that other cities have, we already have barriers to entry that we have to overcome just to come into Commerce City. And you know, the tap fees are a huge portion of that. I talk to people all the time who would love to come here, but when they look at, you know, long-term comparatives with our neighbors, they just can't do it because the cost of doing business here with our tax structure and our development fees on top of tap fees make it very tough for them to commit to the long-term into Commerce City. And that's what's going to drive our financial success and keep us all in a place where we can continue delivering projects that we all have a vision for. You know, again, I think having building standards and land development code standards and more fine planning outside of a generalized PUD is all needed, because we can outline that balance and how it should happen, so we can have better barriers between residential and industrial, or residential and commercial. But almost the entire focus of Airtropolis has been on bringing industrial and commercial business to the airport region. So that's where we fit into that. I mean, that's where, you know, the part of the drive of moving to Commerce City is, you know, I used to have 200 plus employees that worked for me at a transportation company. And the reason I moved to Commerce City is the same reason they live in Commerce City, is because it was close to work. It was great access to their work. It was at a price range that they can afford, with a good blue collar job, and they really enjoyed living here. And so I run into people all the time who talk about how great, you know, they hear the same thing, how bad this vision of Commerce City is from an outside perspective, but when you live here, how great it is, and how they can drive 4 minutes to work instead of having to drive from Denver and 45 minutes, you know, through the worst traffic through I-25. So, you know, they're picking here, which helps reduce congestion in our regional area, which fits better for their you know, young families as they're trying to raise their families. So I think there's a lot of positives that we miss in some of these conversations. And, you know, when I was campaigning for this seat, somebody asked me how I'm going to promote that we turn in the next Highlands Ranch. And I think I've told you guys this before. That's the worst idea possible, because our demographic and where we sit in the metro area is not Highlands Ranch. We're never going to be Highlands Ranch. And quite honestly, I don't want to come close to even becoming Highlands Ranch, because that's just not the community we set out to build 20, 30 years ago. And that's not what we're set out to be. And so understanding where our strengths are today and how we can continue to build on those while building balance into a good community, maintaining open spaces, you know, using land development code and planning to establish where some of these larger retailers can come into when the time's ready, and then continuing to strategically build mixed use with residential focus in areas that make a lot of sense will start to pay off in the long run. But I just don't think we can look at ourselves as something that we're not. And right now we are very good at attracting transportation, warehousing, because of all of the secondary support businesses that go hand in hand with that. And quite honestly, that goes into that's part of a much bigger regional and statewide plan of locating businesses closer to where people work, you know, having your transportation and distribution facilities close to the metro area to reduce GHGs, reduce vehicle miles traveled, generate less trips by doing third-party combination deliveries. And so all of that plays a role. A lot of that's being focused in what's being defined as the new industrial triangle from Hudson to Bennett to Commerce City and North Aurora. It's expanding that. And so, you know, taking the spaceport into consideration, taking DIA into consideration, all of those become transportation hubs, and they all become part of the distribution network that our state's going to rely on as it grows to be able to service not only the customers in Colorado, but to export the goods that we are manufacturing here and growing here. So just want to continue to advocate for finding a balance, but understanding where our strengths currently are today and finding how we can retain and continue to build those relationships. So that tax revenue continues to support our city's operations.
Would staff like to respond to that? Thank you. Thanks, Roger.
Councilman, I think I want to take you with me when you talk about how an economy works, because some of those pieces were really well said. Thank you.
Michelle, can I add a point?
Sure.
My comments about how retailing perceives the core city is not meant to say we need to turn our back on or ignore or change that aspect. My point is that right now, when you really, if you just are looking to your point earlier about on the surface level, there's no other story than the heavy industrial component. And so what's missing is what I think is it Councilmember, if I mispronounce your last name, I apologize. Is it Gordis? He's absolutely right. We need to have a story that relates to retailing and why, and all of the things about the core city that are very positive and have been lost somewhere, because right now the messaging, at least to the outside or to the retailing community, is unfortunately skewed into a certain perspective. It just needs to be more full spectrum than it currently is. And I think that that's part of the education of helping the general retailing community from outside of Commerce City better understand the core, which right now they don't. So it was not meant to say we have to be somebody different than we are, or we have to ignore or turn a blind eye to that component to be successful. I'm just saying that the story isn't complete. And when we go out to tell the story about the core, it needs to be complete.
And Katie, can you clarify that the story is going to be unique to retailing? So it may not be the overall image story or story that Council-wide might have with residents. It really is something specific that we're going to use for retailers.
Correct. But I would say this. I mean, I spent a lot of time Googling, and I really couldn't find good imagery that popped up about Commerce City and the core that really showed the depth of the residential and the families and the, you know, it doesn't relate. So to that degree, I do agree with some of the comments that came out about, you know, having a broader perspective about the core on the internet. But when we go out to talk to retailing, you know, they're, you know, listen, I mean, all these guys get inundated by every community. Some of these guys work half the United States, work the middle of the United States, they work multiple states. They don't have time to do deep dives on communities. It's our job to help them understand the community and the opportunities within it. And so that's part of Michelle and mine's job, is to be able to tell a complete story as it pertains to the core.
And Katie, can you talk about timing, since we are in the middle of a pandemic? I mean, we want to tell our story, but is there better timing than not? Do we wait? Do we start now? What's the best timing given the pandemic?
I mean, the pandemic isn't really necessarily playing that much. When we talk about real estate decisions, these are all long lead items anyways, and we talked about that a little bit during the educational part. You know, guys who are working on deals today may be 2 years out. You know, they may be 18 months out. So they're looking post-pandemic for real estate decisions. And so, you know, I think as we're putting together materials and really recruitment materials, or our propaganda, however you want to look at it, you know, as we're going out to talk to people and educate them about what our opportunities are and kind of correct any misconceptions they have about us, we can start doing that right away. There's no need to have to sit back and wait for the pandemic to go away. So we can definitely start that now.
So just to add to those responses, the last point I wanted to make on this is that, like the reverse setback discussion that we had, this isn't our land. We're not out there advertising our land. It's in our growth area, yeah. But if we go out and we set land development codes and start zoning areas that are within our growth area based on how we want to see them, you can price the owner of that land right out of ever selling it. You know, you can make it to where they'll never touch it. They'll stay in the county and they'll do what they want to do with it. Whether it's oil and gas or whatever the case may be, we can put something there that's not going to work for them long-term to sell based off of the way that we see the city growing. Make more sense for them to hold on to it until it makes more sense for them to sell, because it'll drive the value down of that land so much that they just won't be able to do anything with it. And so we have to be conscious, again, that we don't own any of this land that we're talking about outside that's undeveloped right now. All of it is speculation on what we want to see, but without the deed in hand, we don't get to tell that person when they have to sell. or when they have to annex, unless they create an action that forces that. And we're not force annexing. So most of the time that's going to be a development that's going to require new water resources. And so we just have to be cognizant that, you know, private land ownership doesn't have to comply with what we see it until they turn over hands and that use changes and they come into our city. And so we just have to be aware of that as well, because if we're driving down the value by the decisions that we're making, why sell that land, hold on to it until the value comes back?
Anybody else on council have any questions regarding these presentations? Seeing none, I apologize to council. I have a couple of pages of notes that I'd like to get some questions on. I'd like to start on the very first presentation in the very beginning, talking about the demographics of the Northern Range. There are comments in there regarding east of E470, and it's just not feasible to develop over there. So my question is, how come 2 years ago it was such a emergent issue that we spent $13 million to take utilities on the east side of E470, that this was the next growth area for Commerce City, if we find out now that that's actually not a very prudent investment that we were told to make?
Can I take that?
I'll jump in first, Katie, and then you can clean up, because it'll probably need a lot of cleanup. But my comment would be that for me, the step of getting utilities on the east side of E470 was, yes, the first phase is residential. Second phase was some commercial at the 104th and 270 interchange, basically. But the real key driver for me was to get to getting a business park started on the east side of E470. And that's certainly down the road a ways, but getting the utilities over to the east side was the key first step. Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the east side of E470 may not be as attractive as the west side of E470, especially as we are not fully developed out, just because of the limitations of the residential growth. I mean, instinctively, retailers are going to want to be on the west side because they feel like they have a more of a balanced trade area versus getting on the east side where you feel like you're starting to get up against DIA. I want to add something too. I mean, the demographics that are in this report came mostly from the retail coach. I do think that Michelle and I need to go back and really hone down and create demographics that make more sense to each particular sector of retailing. So they're going to change. They're going to be different for each one. But because some of the things that the retail coach has in here, I don't think are probably realistic, such as extending a trade area all the way up over to, up onto what is the east side of Thornton. That's not realistic. And so, and as Roger said, I think it's important as we're talking about needing to building out a deeper or more in-depth trade area in terms of land uses. The east certainly has a strong role to play in that regards. It doesn't take up more valuable, perhaps, retail land on the west side of E470, but it creates that depth of trade area that is currently missing and is necessary to attract some of the larger forms of retail.
Okay, thank you. My next question deals with page 11, where you reference Aldi. And on there it says Aldi is located in 36 states with over 2,000 stores. Colorado is not one of those 36 states. In fact, west of the Mississippi, only California has Aldi stores up 78. When I looked at the Aldi website, I found that there are 106 stores in Missouri, 18 in Kansas, 23 in Oklahoma, and over 100 in Texas, as well as several others in states like Iowa, Arkansas, and Minnesota. Now, if my understanding of geography is the way it is, all those states are west of the Mississippi. So my question is, if this report is so erroneous in that regard, how can I trust the validity of anything else in the report?
Well, that's going to, my apologies. You are correct in terms of where the Mississippi is located. So they are not in any of the western states other than California. So You can take me at my face value that they're not coming to Colorado or not working in Colorado. And if you feel like that actual misrepresentation negates the whole report, there's not much I can do about that.
Okay, in talking about Sprouts and natural grocers, it says that we don't have the density or the population in order to support that. Yet down in Green Valley Ranch, they just opened a natural grocers and now they have a Sprouts coming in around 56th Avenue. Looking at the population totals, there's about 36,000 residents in Green Valley Ranch. And according to the slide in your presentation, we have 39,000 residents in the northern range of Commerce City. So how can you justify that we don't have the population numbers whenever down to south of us, they are getting 2 of these specialty stores with less residents than we have?
So I talked to both of these grocers about this particular decision making. And the reason that they chose that marketplace is because of the potential growth. They felt that overall the market was better situated to support us than the northern range. And those decisions have been made. I mean, those are not decisions that we can pick up the phone and say, hey guys, you're wrong. You should be looking at the northern range of Commerce City. And to your point, I don't think that that's totally inaccurate in the sense that we are probably poised closer to be able to garner a Sprouts. We're just not on their radar screen at this point in time. Those sites felt better to them, and we may be in a better position to attract them for yet another store. But when I gave them some of our demographic information, they were pretty surprised. So they weren't necessarily looking at the northern range. They've been looking at Brighton and Commerce City as a combined market opportunity. Both of those grocers have been. And they haven't felt that they could find a location that both cities would actually gravitate to. And the Tower Road site for them, I mean, in terms of what their demographics are versus our demographics, I don't disagree with you. I think they are pretty comparable. I think it just came down to a fact where those sites were higher profile in their mind and something that they were more comfortable with than perhaps locating in either Brighton or in Commerce City. And that was true for both Sprouts and for natural grocers. And obviously those are going to be touch points for us in talking to them and really trying to get them to be more interested in the northern range. I can tell you though, he looked me straight in the face and said, Katie, I just don't feel like there's enough population base there. And I said, I think you have a misconception about what's there. And he said, I'm certainly open to having that conversation with you.
That's kind of troubling because you said that they weren't aware of our population numbers. And I would think that the city has a department that would be good at spreading that information out there so that retailers like this would know. Talking about Victory Crossing.
I want to answer that for a minute. To be fair, retailers aren't just roaming around on people's websites looking at demographics. I mean, in terms of usually where interest really initiates from is from the development community. And there's no one in your development community on the 104th corridor has bothered to reach out to any of these 2 grocers. Now, you can say that the city should have done it instead of those, but generally speaking, it should be your landowners on 104th who do one of the initial reach out, and no one on the 104th corridor has reached out to them.
You stated the private sector does not seem to understand the development focus for Victory Crossing. That site's sat dormant for 13 years now. Why is it that in the last 13 years, nobody has developed this plan for what could go there? And why hasn't that partnership been with our economic development department, the landowner, and potential developers in order to ensure that a bulletproof plan is put together so that we don't spend another 13 years of dormant site with no activity?
There was a plan presented to council and the URA board, I want to say 5 years ago, might have been a little longer than that, which had a vision of basically sports related businesses, including some additional sports facilities, namely indoor basketball court and sports medicine related type of businesses. Part of that was a presentation by them to ask the city, or the Urban Renewal Authority actually, to extend the 25-year clock for TIF. And at that time, the board refused to do that. And so that didn't materialize and went away. So I think that was the original vision as well, is to have sports related, type of facilities as well as entertainment, to have a entertainment corridor along 60th Avenue, basically, all related to, people attending the stadium. And so unfortunately there have been opportunities, but those were rejected.
And 5 years ago was 3 city councils ago. In politics, that was a lifetime ago. So my question is, why are we not pushing this now and trying to move this project forward and coming back with the URA and saying that this is what we need to do in order to go make this happen?
How much time do you have? There's a lot of story behind that. And
that's okay, we can move on. I heard a couple times about different trade areas and barriers to trade areas and things that get cut off. One of them was 76 cuts off a retail area. That makes a trade barrier there. The refuge is a continual excuse as far as a barrier. But I look at Prairie View Center, and I see 76 running on the eastern side of that development. I see right across the street from that, I see a big lake out there. Why are these not considered barriers? And if they were barriers to development, then what did Brighton do in order to overcome it that we are not doing as Commerce City?
Well, I-76 is definitely a barrier. And if you actually look to the east of I-76, I wouldn't tell you that there's a great deal of residential support on the east side of Brighton that plays into Prairie Center's location. Why Cronky chose THF at the time, why they chose that location and why they chose that site in Brighton, I can't answer that for you. I wasn't privy to those deal economics or the deal decisions as they came into Brighton.
Okay. Lastly, your very first slide showed a picture of all these restaurants that are supposed to be in the northern range of Commerce City, and the one that stands out is Dairy Queen. So can somebody tell the residents what the latest news is regarding that Dairy Queen, which has sat vacant since the moment construction was completed? Is it ever going to open up, or should we plan on tearing that down through the use of URA or some other mechanism in order to get rid of that building? Because it is quite embarrassing that we have a brand new facility sitting there not opened. And that ties into the facility at 104th and Tower that sat vacant for how many years? All the pad sites that are sitting next to 7-Eleven at Highway 2 and 104th Avenue, the pad sites sitting next to North Range Eye Care, and all the pad sites that are sitting empty in Parkway Plaza. Why is it that we have all these empty facilities that we can't seem to get anybody to open a business in?
Katie, why don't I start with Dairy Queen, and then if you want to add to anything that you want to pull out as far as, because this you and I had a long conversation about availability of property and all of that. But as far as Dairy Queen, that Dairy Queen was built by a national company that owns a lot of franchise operations for Dairy Queen. And unfortunately, when COVID hit, that really affected the company. So they are in the process of trying to sell that franchise to a different owner, and have not had, last I have heard from them, they have not had any luck doing that.
Have we had anybody reach out to you in order to get help to transition with that sale?
Mayor, as you know, you had somebody that contacted you that was interested in buying the franchise. So we connected them with the current franchise owner. And I have followed up with that gentleman a couple times, and he has not responded back whether he is still interested in doing that or not, or what he found out.
Thank you.
Katie, did you want to add anything about?
Why
just because there's a lot doesn't mean it's going to develop.
Well, you're in a growth corridor, so you know, you had some of the retail that was absorbed, and you have a lot of retail that's not absorbed yet. It's all been developed so far. The things that have somewhat been developed are developed in a convenience factor. There's been a great deal of convenience retail that's come into the corridor, and you apparently still have room for more. So, you know, they're just not ready to be absorbed because you haven't reached a level of maturation on the 104th or for the Northern Range trade area yet.
And what efforts are we exhibiting in an economic development department to try to fill these properties?
So that is the million-dollar question. How many resources and what the vision is and where you put the resources. Right now, once COVID has hit, we've really been working with a lot of our existing restaurant owners. They are really struggling. And so a lot of our resources really are more into that than the marketing. We're hoping now that Katie has done a lot of her research that yes, we can start going out and doing some of the marketing, but we really have to work with our restaurants now and make sure that our community is supporting them, that we are finding ways for them to find new avenues for revenue, do different models of food delivery, whatever it's going to take to keep them in business during this so that we don't have to backtrack next spring, hopefully when COVID is not as prevalent and attract more at that point.
I also think it speaks to the quantity that we were talking about earlier about the 104th corridor. You have opportunity to absorb more convenience-based retailing by some of these existing, you know, undeveloped pads that are out there. So I think it becomes an interesting conversation as we talk about implementing or approving more pads on the corridor, which is that proliferation of that convenience retailing that I was talking about. You know, we've reached a certain level of saturation based on the current residential density that's in this trade area. As we continue to mature, some of those other opportunities are going to get absorbed. But how many more opportunities do you actually need to allocate for or approve or designate for? Or do we need to be looking at you know, the maintenance of some of those sites for different depths of retailing that are currently not willing to show up in the corridor yet? So that kind of all plays back into that whole conversation of learning to have some patience in the corridor and learning to create that planning and visioning aspect for the corridor.
The other part of the answer, dealing specifically with economic development, in 2019, there were 4 employees in the economic development division. For most of 2020, it was 2 employees, you know, so they lost 50% of the employees. City Council gave the priority of restaurants, and so the division pivoted towards restaurants in 2019. And as you saw from the very first presentation in the special meeting, we provided grants to businesses using the CARES Act money, and that took in excess of 400 hours. So out of 4,000 hours, given 2 employees, 10% went towards just implementing the grant program. So, there's definitely an impact in terms of staff capacity when you lose 50% of your employees and also have different priorities. So I would ask that everyone keep that in mind as we talk about, retail attraction and where we go next. And so that all comes back to what is the priority going to be from City Council.
Thank you for those comments. So can you explain to me in better detail what exactly it looks like to be helping our restaurant businesses? What are we doing that is actually what actions daily are taking place in order to help these restaurants? What is consuming so much of the time in that department?
Well, first off, and Councilman Guardiola, you can attest to this. We didn't know who our restaurants were. And so we have spent a lot of time really putting together that list of the restaurants, who they are, who the contact information or person is, and really trying to get to know them. So the team has really reached out to restaurants and spoken to them several times. And then when COVID first hit, you know, the biggest thing was information. You know, there was just so many information gaps. And restaurants with these health orders really weren't sure how they were supposed to operate. So we tried to quickly react and put together the business COVID page that really started collecting that information about the health orders, about all of the finance programs that were out there, PPP, EIDL, whatever it was. And then we were heard that, well, a lot of the information that was coming out was not in Spanish. And so a lot of our Spanish-speaking business owners, including a lot of our restaurant owners in the core city, weren't quite getting the information. So we were one of the first ones to host a online webinar to start talking about what those resources were available. And so we've held, I think since then, I think we've had 6 that are specific to either the Spanish-speaking businesses or our restaurant owners. To talk about the health orders, to talk about financing options, to talk about whatever. So then we opened up the rounds of small business grants, and we've had 3 rounds total. Those are a lot of work to put those rounds together. So when the first round opened at $200,000, people were still trying to understand what that looked like. Okay, you had to be geographically located within Commerce City. You had to have a business license. You had to make sure that you had your sales and use tax up to date. Well, if you didn't have a business license, chances were that you didn't have a sales and use tax. So our team worked with those restaurants and with our small businesses to try to get them through the system at the city. So we worked with them to get their business license, and then we worked with them to get their online sales and use tax things set up. So that was just a lot of hands-on, one-on-one work. And then this last round was home-based businesses. So I think we've done a total of about 150 applications, and I think about 112. It's in that slide from earlier, but 112 grants. Then we had a lot of those grantees have to do reporting. So what happened is the IRS started giving out the federal government started giving out CARES Act dollars, but then came up with the guidelines after some of the money had been deployed. So we had to go back and really work with the small businesses and help them understand what the reporting looked like, help them put it together and collect all that. And there were several restaurants that were recipients of those grants. On top of that, we wanted to start the revolving loan fund, and that was something that was already in our program for this year. So we had the first round of $200,000 of seed money, and then we added $200,000. So we had $400,000 to work with Colorado Enterprise Fund. Well, we had to do an agreement with them to get all the kinks worked out on what that looked like. As it turns out now, so we've had about 10 companies respond to that. The restaurants are really nervous about taking on more debt. And so at this point, they're really looking at the grant opportunities and not the revolving loan fund. However, at the end of the year, when all of the CARES Act money goes away, if the federal government does not put more money out there, then there may not be any other funding options than the revolving loan fund. So that's why it's important for us to kind of keep that going as a long-term tool. And then it came with the opportunity of expanding outdoor spaces. So some of the restaurants, if they had the capability of expanding their outdoor spaces, what did that look like? And so we worked as a team within the city with the planning department, with one of the business analysts to communicate all of that to our restaurants to see which ones that might pertain to and if they could increase their capacity, since the health order said they could be at 50% health capacity, to use that outdoor patio space as a way to get more clients to come in. And so now we're getting ready to pivot to another discussion point that we want to bring to council in a couple weeks, and that's about third-party delivery fees. And so we're hearing that third-party delivery fees are really starting to take a big chunk out of the revenues for our restaurants who are already struggling. So some of the other municipalities throughout the state have put caps on those. So we're going to bring that discussion to council to see what they would like to do as far as that. But right now we're researching that, trying to put together some thoughtful conversation for you in the next couple weeks. So that's an example of some of the work that we're doing on an ongoing basis to try to be as helpful as we can. As you saw tonight, we we're asking for some more CARES Act dollars to put some more iterations of that work in place. We can't be all things to all people, but that's why I wanted to put that restaurant plan together to talk about specifically some more ideas on how we can help these restaurants make it through the pandemic. Mayor Huesman, does that answer your question?
It does, and it's also troubling to me that we never knew what restaurants and what businesses run our city. But my last comment is the continual thing that kept being said is it's your job to tell the story about Commerce City and explain to them that we're not just the industrial area, and explain to them the demographics and everything. So my question is, why hasn't this been taking place? Why did it require a contract with Katy Press in order to identify the fact that we need to do that?
You know, I know that throughout the history of Commerce City, and Roger, you'll have to help me because my history doesn't go back that far, but there have been long conversations about, you know, do we run a public relations campaign? Do we not? What do we do? What do we don't? To me, I'm hearing two different conversations. If it's just for the retail, that's what Katie and my team is hoping to work on over the next several months, is to really put that business case together. We have been putting business case together, but it hasn't been working. And it's because we have been doing some things that are counterintuitive to what Katie is educating us on. So that's why we wanted to bring Katie in. She is the expert. When, you know, our team calls a national retailer, they don't know who we are. When Katie calls the local representative or the national retailer that she's been working with for 20 years, they pay a little bit more attention. So to us, it was really important for us to bring Katie into the fold to start this conversation. If it goes beyond retail, then I'll have to have another staff member or have Roger talk about that.
The other thing I would address is that our our business licensing system has never been focused on obtaining and retaining information about active businesses. And it was focused purely on a license to collect the sales tax. In the past, we have proposed that there be an annual renewal of the business license because what we found is that typically, you know, the contact person listed for a business on their original application for a business license, that person left the company and there's no longer valid contact information. And so our proposal was for emergency contact, for economic development reasons, we should basically have an annual renewal. That was not embraced, and there for a while, the police department tried to set up a system to track who the contact information would be for each company and found that unwieldy. So we really need to change some of our business practices, and that takes authorization of City Council to do that, to retain the up-to-date emergency contact information as well as information that's needed for economic development purposes, because we could have a business that has a business license issued in pick a date, 1972, and there's no update on the information because, you know, there hasn't been any contact with that company in terms of our systematic tracing of that company for business licensing purposes. So that, you know, again, part of this is we're a city that is approaching 60,000 population, and we still have some business practices in place that date from 1972, which, you know, we were a town of 12,000 people back then. And so we really have to update a lot of our business practices. And unfortunately, that is counter to some, you know, philosophy in terms of leaving businesses alone. And so we have to make a choice. Either we have up-to-date information or we leave businesses alone. And that comes down to a philosophical decision by City Council. And so I'll do my best to identify those situations for you, but it takes city council decision to whether we progress from where we were or if we remain stuck in 1972.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Does anyone on council have any follow-up questions or anything? Councilman Wadiola?
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to know, I thought you did, we're open for retail campaign. Is that different than what you guys are doing now, or are we continuing that? I know we had some nice brochures, it went out, and then it just stopped. Is it kind of like similar of what you guys are revamping?
You know, I'm hoping Katie will inform us. We liked our Ready for Retail campaign. We just didn't have the resources to keep it going. We really didn't have the manpower, and we didn't have the marketing dollars in our budget to keep it going.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Councilwoman Noble?
Sorry. I'd like to just comment for a minute on the Dairy Queen. And as much as people would like to see that open, I really want to thank the company for keeping that site looking as brand new as it is. Given the fact that it's been almost a year, they could have really let that run into the ground, and they haven't. My understanding is that Dutch Brothers has already changed hands for around $2 million. They certainly have a line just about all the time I see it, and I suspect that Dairy Queen would too, considering all the people who talk about it. So hopefully something will come with that soon. I hope, Mr. Tinklenberg, that you will bring forward then whatever we need to discuss in order to have the kind of records that we need on all the businesses in Commerce City. And finally, given the fact that this is we're in the midst of a pandemic, retention of the businesses that we do have is quite key. And clearly we have directed a lot of money towards retaining our businesses. So that is an equally good use of economic development, because of course there aren't going to be a lot of businesses that are thinking about, oh gee, now's a great opportunity to move into Commerce City. We need to keep the businesses that we have operating here and staying alive for our community. So that's important as well. But there certainly are a lot of issues that we've talked about tonight that are going to be really interesting to continue to discuss as we move forward. Thank you so much for bringing it all forward.
And one last time, any other questions or comments for staff regarding this topic? Seeing none, we'll thank both of you for your time to come here and give us this information, as well as the time put in to put in the reports together. This time we move on to reports. Are there any council members have any reports to make? Seeing none, I have one. Seeing none, I have one brief one. Last week I did sit down with representatives from the Fry family, as well as a potential developer that is interested in developing the area around the 72nd and Colorado Station. I thought it was a very good meeting, and there seems to be some interest moving forward on getting that going. So again, I do believe that we need to take a look at our stationary master plan and make sure that it's current for 2020, since it was put together almost 10 years ago. And Mr. Tinklenberg?
Yes, sir. I have not taken any time off all year this year, and starting to feel a little frayed on some of the edges. So I would like to take off October 20 through 23rd. That would be next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. During that time, the police chief would be the acting city manager. So just wanted to give you a heads up and see if they're by head nods, if that sounds okay. Okay, appreciate that. Thank you. And then second item is a question for you. One of the council members mentioned the difficulty of being able to both Zoom and access information from the agenda at the same time. Is there an interest in having a second tool to use, probably a second iPad, so that you can access both at the same time. I see one negative head shake. Thoughts? Want to think about it?
I think the comment, so I'm the one that brought that up, and I think the comment comes from kind of where I stand. You use your personal computer for something at City Council, it's now accessible to core requests. Obviously, there's parameters on core requests, and there's parameters around that I'm sure our city attorney would keep your personal information out of those requests. But then the same thing too for me is if I use my state computer for anything with the City Council, I can be in trouble. And so I'm having to set up 3 separate computer systems in my basement at my desk to try to manage through all of this. And so trying to find a way, sometimes you'll see my screen go blacked out, and it's because I'm getting in Granicus to look ahead to see what notes I wrote for myself when I was studying. So I can try to be not so long-winded on certain issues that I had some clear points I wanted to make, and that becomes it. So was just trying to say, you know, I have no problem. We open ourselves up to liability for using this just like we would at any other job, using your personal technology for work. We're running into the same issues here. And so while I'm trying to do our meetings using our iPad, you know, without printing all the documents or printing all your notes or something like that, you're kind of forced to go into your Granicus app, you know, shut off your camera, go into your Granicus app, and to pull that up. So that was the only reason I brought that up. I have other options around it, but I brought it up to Dylan, just asking if anybody else was having the issue. Because to me, you know, as we voted last week to extend virtual meetings to continue for the foreseeable future, I don't know how long, just wanted to create a better working environment, if you will. I don't know if that you can do that when you're in your basement, but just trying to find a way where I can be more prepared, if you will. I prepare, you know, before the meeting, but then all that preparation gets stuck behind the Granicus app, or, you know, put into a Word document, print it out, and then I'm doing it that way. And so was just trying to find if anybody else has got a solution that doesn't involve, you know, putting your personal electronics with the liability.
And thank you for not being long-winded with that, Councilwoman Noble.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Matt Hayter about that, since I'm on my personal laptop right now.
So I think what you're asking me about is the extent to which information on your personal laptop can be obtained through Quora requests. Is that really where you're going? So,
right, since I'm losing it for a meeting, right?
Yeah, that's the fact that you're using it for a meeting doesn't really come into play. The bottom line is, you know, if we receive a Quora request, it's for records that are city records, and the chances of you having city records on your personal computer are pretty slim to none. And typically they'd be things that we would also have copies of with the city. What we're talking about essentially is if you have a personal email address that you access from your personal computer on a standalone app that might be native only to that computer, you maybe would be asked to go and look for those emails or something like that. But this isn't the type of thing where we're going to come in and do a search of your computer, or nobody else has the right to do that. It's not a Fourth Amendment, you know, search warrant to come do that. You know, as I'm sure you've all seen in the past, Quora requests are typically quite specific, or at least we can narrow it down to specific types of issues and particular documents that we're looking for in response to a Quora request. But your personal information has not become searchable by the city by any means, just because you're using a personal computer to conduct a meeting.
Thank you.
But Hatch Act does bring up violations of overusing. You know, if you use a personal during work hours to answer anything besides work, it then becomes, you can be in trouble. We get reminded about this in my job more often than I want to talk about. So maybe I'm overcautious for sure. There's definitely that possibility, but the question to Dylan was more about, what the regulations are. We went over and read them together. Obviously didn't ask him to advise me, but just wanted to make sure that his understanding was similar to mine. And he said he would take this forward. I have a solution that I have on my own. He just wanted to see if anybody else was having this issue so it could be addressed as a group if it was necessary. If it's just me who wants to find the solution, I have one already. I'm ready to go on it. So, and I'll make those purchases on my own. So just wanted to have that quick discussion, but that's where it comes from.
Can I follow up for just a minute? Mr. Hayter, what about our personal cell phones? I use that frequently to look at agendas and things like that. Is that an issue?
Your use of the cell phone to look at a city agenda, absolutely not. That's not an issue at all. Again, what we're talking about is city records, official records, often associated with spending that the city keeps as a matter of business. Communications, of course, on official business, so email on your phone or something like that. Text messages as well, and all these types of things that could be sought by a query request. So it's just a matter of, it's always has to have that connection to your role, your position, or official government functions and documents associated with that. So it's hard to speculate on every situation and just to have a generic example, like, is a cell phone itself protected? Because it really depends on what is there. So it's much easier to address specific questions than the general ones. But for the most part, there's not a lot of concerns associated with that. I can tell you recently we've done subpoena responses that have included police officer cell phone screenshots of messages and things of that nature because they're responsive in litigation. And we'll continue to do that and work with those people that have phones and to look through those records. And that, of course, as I indicated, was in a subpoena context. But the same would be true if it came in the form of a query request.
Thank you.
Mr. Tinklenberg?
So I gather from that discussion that no one else is interested in a second device. Not seeing anyone jumping up and down, so okay. I guess Mr. Hurst is on his own now.
Any other council reports? Councilwoman Grimes?
I just had a technology question since we're kind of on that topic. I know that a lot of us have different cases for our iPads, and the one that I have in particular doesn't have a trackpad on it. And I don't know if anyone else's does, but just curious if anyone would be interested in maybe raising that as a potential to get cases with trackpads just for ease of use.
Mr. Tinklenberg?
I think Councilman Bordiola just bought a nice mouse you might want to tell us about.
Yeah, I just did a Bluetooth and it works amazing. It beats going back and forth with the pen. I just found it on Amazon and it was like $12, and that's what I've been using.
Cool, thanks for that.
Any other reports? Councilwoman Noble?
I have a couple. Speaking of sports and Dick's Sporting Goods and Victory Crossing, someone was asking, a constituent was asking about pickleball courts. And I guess this would be for Parks and Rec. I said I didn't know if that was part of our upcoming budget, but he thought this would be good for Commerce City to have some pickleball courts somewhere. And secondly, there was a really interesting conversation last week with a very active golfer at Buffalo Run, who's part of the men's club, who had observed water issues at Buffalo Run. And he did wind up meeting with the head of maintenance and other people at Buffalo Run. Turns out that the water that we get from Buffalo Run is from Aurora, and Aurora, not from South Adams County Water and Sanitation District, and that Aurora isn't necessarily all that keen on continuing to give us water for a golf course. So I was thinking that at some point in the future, having a discussion about the Buffalo Run golf course and what our commitment to it is would probably be useful. It is sort of a wonderful open space jewel, if you will, and public, and has a lovely restaurant. But in order to keep it looking as good as it does, Commerce City may have to step up and do something extra for it. So we might need to look at that in the future. I just wanted to raise that as something that will be coming down the road, perhaps.
I'm puzzled by that because our irrigation water is groundwater. You know, we have a well, and our drinking water comes from South Adams County Water Sanitation District. So why did they think the water came from Aurora?
Because that was what they were told. That there is some rule that is preventing them from watering in the way that they should because it's Aurora water, not South Adams County water.
I think there was confusion. We purchased augmentation water from City of Westminster, not Aurora, and that allows us to pump the well. So the augmentation water is to replace water that comes out of the tributary aquifer for the South Platte River. And so by purchasing augmentation water from the City of Westminster, we replace that water. So, but it is limited, that is true. There's a limit on how much we can pump.
Okay, well, I know that I responded to him with the comment about the Gaylord Hotel, which had wanted to put in a golf course, but Aurora wouldn't let them because of water issues. So I'm going to send you all of his notes, which were copious, so that we can take a look at it and make sure that everybody is sharing the right information and that the course is getting the necessary water so that the grass doesn't die on the greens and in the fairways that will make it more difficult to come back in the spring.
Sure, that sounds good, thank you.
So I was not going to address this until next week whenever we have administrative council business, which is the time for addressing these matters. But since Councilwoman Noble brought this up, I do want to say I've also been contacted by residents who feel that the golf course is in horrible condition, that it is not being watered. And one resident was actually told by golf course staff that because of water restrictions, we're not watering the golf course. So I think there's more to the story that we can hopefully flesh out in the future. Any other reports that actual legitimate council reports that anybody needs to give? Seeing none, thank you everybody for your time. We are adjourned. Have a great week. See you next week.